primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of Elite FTS for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it. Now, onto the show.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. Okay, what's going on? We're coming to you from the simulated weight room. Inside joke, right? So it's not a real weight room, it's a simulated one.
Just hanging around with Justin for the last couple days has made me realize, well, first off, Dani and Justin, thank you for joining us here at the Table Talk. I have never felt so small and so dumb in this at the same time. You guys are absolute fucking powerhouses. Dani, this is your first time on the podcast, correct?
Yes, sir.
How's it feel? How's it feel to be here?
I mean, this is a simulation, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So you can feel however you want.
Not really here.
Click the button. Pick your emoji.
Justin, you're a veteran at this point. Is this your third time, second time?
He was doing it before it was a Table Talk.
Yeah, we used to. Yeah, this used to be on the end of a bench in that, like the S2 compound. With, I don't even think we had a microphone. No, we did. We might have actually handed a microphone back.
Yeah.
So you'd hold the microphone, and then I'd try to grab it from your hand and talk.
And Dave just went to the dentist, so that's perfect. So
Yeah.
we're all here, locked and loaded. We've been able to shoot a ton of awesome videos the last couple days. I think all of the content that we made so far is absolutely awesome. I'm really, really excited to share that. Justin, we went over a lot with nutrition. We went over a lot with just training intensity. Dani, same thing. We kind of locked in on, the clinical side of things, but also how that training can be, the clinical side or the performance side, right? So I think what are the big rocks do you think that you've taken away from some of the stuff that we've been working on over the last couple days?
It's always really interesting to me when you look at a guy like Justin, who's been training for how many years now? Many.
Oh, well, like 27.
Yeah.
Like 5 times a week, but probably 35 from when I first did my first bench press.
I mean, you think about that, and a lot of people listening to this podcast may not even be 27 years old. So he's literally been training longer than some of these people have been alive. And, looking at some of his movement patterns and when he has a hard time developing certain muscle groups, things like that, you think about what a textbook says should happen. And he's a great example of how you can just tweak a couple of things. And even if movement doesn't look how it should, there are a lot of ways that we can improve movement, performance, control.
Like we were working on that movement with your upper back.
Yeah,
right?
I found out why my trap suck.
Yeah. Do you want to explain that? Because we talked about weak points a little bit too.
Well, yeah. I have a general thought, and this ties in perfectly. My general thought on weak point is I think people just bring up weak points, approach it all wrong. The standard approach is, my lats are weak. I'll train them twice a week. I'll train them more often. And no one ever seems to stop and think, why are my lats weak? I'm training them, and I'm training them the same frequency as everything else. If they're not growing from that, why is doing more of the same thing that's not working going to suddenly work? And so you need to really think are my lats weak? Sometimes there's structural components. There's not as many fibers there. You see a lot in arms. A lot of people have like short biceps, or their triceps, the way they're formed, just aren't met. They don't have the ability to get very large. But typically it's because you're not targeting that muscle. So just doing the same bad workouts more often isn't going to improve anything. You need to start from scratch and find new movements that actually work. And that's what Dani did, show me finally how to activate my traps in my upper back on a row movement. A little late. I mean, 17 years too late, but
But I think that's the level of knowledge and care. And we spoke a lot about coaching, about how to be a better coach, how to be assist your clients, your athletes, or your own training. How to get that to the best possible place it can be. And as much knowledge and information that we have in the stuff that we shot, in the videos that we shot, it came down to a lot of very basic things. It's like giving a shit, paying attention, asking more questions, right? Like I was watching Dani and Justin training, and they were just constantly asking each other questions back and forth. It's like, how's that feel? Like, what are the sensations that you're feeling with this? And it was just cool to see because as a clinical side, right? Like that's what you would expect a doctor or a PT or someone to, kind of do with somebody in person, which is kind of funny to say out loud because it doesn't happen all the time. And then from the bodybuilding, the higher intensity realm as well, is like, that's the same language. You guys are using the same language to talk about the same thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the minute you stop asking questions or you assume how something is feeling for someone, that's probably when you might be at your dumbest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was just cool to see, and I got to sit back. And I mean, I've watched videos of Justin on Elite FTS for years and years and years, and just conversations between you two, even on older table talks, to be in the room, to be able to, participate in that and ask those questions and to be part of that was just really, really cool for me personally as a total fucking fanboy moment here. But we ended up getting a lot of questions from the audience, from our social medias that I kind of want to direct the conversation to, and specifically towards bodybuilding, powerlifting, right? Intensity, the things that we kind of talked about over the last few days. Justin has had a history with DC training, dog crap training, higher intensity training. Dani uses some of those principles as well, and not only in your performance or your bodybuilding training or powerlifting training, but also your rehab, like that intensifying the rehab process. And I kind of want to start the conversation with like intensity, right? We kind of had a conversation about high intensity training today.
Yeah, I think high intensity training is kind of interesting because I think something gets lost between the proponents, the way they use it, from when they explain how they use it to the other people who use it. And it feels like, so for me, high intensity or DC training or anything like that, the reason I like it is the clear marker of progress, because there's a lot of confusing things. It's hard to tell whether you're getting better in the gym. And so with like DC training, beating the logbook, progressive overload, if I did 315 for 10 on bench last week, if I repeat the exact same parameters, same rest time, same bench, same weight, and now I do 11 reps, I can be confident that I've progressed. And that, but I think it just gets so, people try to take, most people are here and the truth is here. And so people say, well, when I move that direction, I get closer to the truth. And so people always want to just take it all the way. And I joked, by the end, I felt like Menser, like he'd start writing articles, and I was like, I think the joke I made was like, if all you need is one set of 20 on squats in May and one set to failure of dips in December. Any more than that, and you're overtraining, because they always just try to take it too far. You take it as far as it needs to go. Just because you went that direction and you were getting better doesn't mean you're always going to get better in that direction. Another example I used was like Dorian Yates. Everyone uses him as the high intensity guy, and he was a low volume high intensity guy. But watch Blood and Guts. He does 7 exercises on back day. He does bent over rows and deadlifts on the same workout. Yes, he only does one all-out set, one set to failure, but that's still 7 movements. And so it's not like a low volume. It's not like he's going in and just doing one set of deadlifts and a set of pull downs and that's his back workout.
Well, he's working up to that weight too.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If it's a 455 Yates row, how did he get there?
He didn't walk in at 455. And so the difference then is that someone else counts their warm-up sets. And so they do a set number of reps. They might do I'm sure he did 405 on the way working up. Someone else would do 405 for 10 and count that as a set. He might have only done 405 for 4 or 3 or 6 reps to just do however it was until he felt he got warmed up enough. So the volume really isn't that different. The standard higher volume guys typically just spend, the difference isn't as dramatic as the HIIT believers think it is. The difference is that the high intensity guys, they're just doing much lower workload on the warm-ups. They're still doing them. It's not quite as intense, and their heaviest set is just a little more intense. The volume guys are just doing a slightly higher intensity or workload on the warm-up sets, and their main set is a little less intense. The overall workload volume isn't really that much different. It's not like the high intensity is low volume and that it's low workload. It's not. It's just the way that the total workload is spread out a little bit different, and it's more focused on those heavy sets. But they still do the warm-ups. Those warm-ups aren't useless. You get as strong as Dorian, he probably did 4 or 5 as a warm-up on bent over rows. That's still taxing on the body.
I think what's important to think about with regards to intensity too is you have to define it, right? So we're going to talk about intensity in terms of proximity to failure. What type of failure? Are you looking at pure concentric muscle failure? Are you looking at technique failure or some variation of a more mechanical failure as well. And if you're not willing to define that, you can't necessarily say that you're training with a certain intensity, especially because a lot of literature now, everyone wants to talk about, how close you have to get to failure for hypertrophy is a really hot topic. So if you're thinking about some of the guys that just did sets of 2 to 4 and some of their feeder sets compared to the high volume guys, it's a question of which of those sets are actually productive from the standpoint of hypertrophy.
Yeah, and I think Justin mentioned this with a conversation we had with nutrition of trying to just aim in the general area of the target. You don't have to hit a bullseye every single time. And you guys had mentioned that you're just trying to cross a threshold, right? Mm-hmm. Do we kind of want to go into that just a little bit more?
Yeah, well, this isn't an exact science. Mm-hmm. Nutrition and lifting. I mean, there's hard science involved, like with nutrition and calories, thermodynamics and law of conservation of energy holds true. But there's a lot more going on than just, it's not like the way it holds true with, filling up your car with gas. That's one. Nutrition is at its core the same thing, but there's more variation. And so what we were talking about, like with the diet, people will think my diet's, because I'll use macros, and a lot of times I'll adjust my macros by only 5 grams. Like I don't adjust protein per meal closer than 5 grams of chunks. And then I have multiple foods that list. So if I give someone 50 grams of protein in a meal, they can pick that 50 grams of protein from chicken or 96.4 ground beef or extra lean ground turkey or turkey breast, and I count them all the same. And so some people will say, well, how does this work? Because 96.4 beef has different calories than chicken. How, if I eat that 6 times a day, my numbers are going to be way off. And what the problem is people don't understand how accurate they can really be with things. And so they look at a food label and they see, for every 25 grams of protein, chicken breast has 2 grams of fat. For every 25 grams of protein, 96.4 ground beef has 4 grams of fat. And that's true roughly on the averages. But if you ate human meat, ground human meat would it'd have to be listed as 85-15 because the average human is 15% body fat. It doesn't mean every human is 15% body fat. And just the same with chicken. Every chicken isn't 2 grams of fat per 25 grams of protein. So a particularly fat chicken might be 4 grams per 25 grams of protein, 4 grams of fat. And a particularly lean, like these 96.4 ground beef, it's not made in a pharmacy. It's not that precise. So they're trying to get about 4% fat in it, but it's not to the milligram. So a particularly lean pound or chunk of 96.4 ground beef might be only 2 grams of fat per 4 grams of 25 grams of protein. So if you're counting it exactly so precise to that, you're thinking you're getting more accuracy, but what you're actually doing is creating inaccuracies because you're saying if you eat 6 meals, that's 2 extra grams of fat for the 96.4 per meal. So that's 12 grams of fat difference. That's well over 100 calories difference. You think if you're counting it according to the food label, but the truth is, if you take the bell curve and where those things lie, you're actually getting inaccurate in the wrong direction because the truth is that the average chicken is 2 grams, the average 96.4 is 4, but there's crossover, and trying to get too precise with it actually creates more variance in the diet that you aren't able to adjust around.
Yeah, and Dave, you've obviously worked with Justin. Mm-hmm. Was that a more of a helpful situation to have, or were you the type that needed to kind of lock in on very specific things?
I don't know. No. I didn't need to lock in. No. I mean, the whole thing was, when we started working together, one of the first conversations was, I don't want to do this last 6 week shit. Yeah. Right. I've been around it my whole life. It's like peaking for a powerlifting meet. Mm-hmm. If you want to stay relatively safe, don't do the last 6 weeks before a show. Don't do the last 6 weeks before a meet. Mm-hmm. That's when things are brutal. So we removed that from the get-go. So then for him, it's like, okay, this can be more lax. So yes, I had a food list like what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And obviously he wasn't going to be as strict with me because the end goal's not the same. Now I had to lose 70 pounds or whatever ridiculous amount of weight it was. And the discipline wasn't going to be a problem either. But it's like you said, if I didn't want chicken, then I had chicken and steak. I'd have both. Mm-hmm. I'd mix it up, because chicken's gross to me, especially if you're eating like 8 ounces. And he's right, the protein never really changed that much. And the other thing too, and it may have changed since then, is I wasn't supposed to count the fat in the protein. The only fat I was supposed to count was the fat that was from the fats that were on that list. Mm-hmm. So that makes it all easier, right?
And that's where people get, that fat is getting counted. It's just that my food list is the foods you'll be giving in your food list are such that for the portions you have per meal, the fat of each of the protein sources will be roughly the same. And it's like that 96.4. They're not exact, but the natural variation between the meats for the amount that you're going to get in your diet, is going to mean we don't need to count the fat. The fat is there and it's implicit in the diet, but I know that each meal is about 4 to 6 grams of fat or whatever from your protein sources. So we're not going to count that, because trying to count that when we can't know the exact amount is actually going to make us less accurate.
So it's, I mean, from my perspective, when I body built before, when I was in college, this was completely different. I mean, before it's like, here's your meal plan. There's 5 meals. You eat egg whites in the morning, you have oatmeal, and it was, like you said, precise, and you never broke, and that's what it was. And I was like, man, I don't want it. So this was like, oh, I can pick from this stuff. This is cool. This works. And it all plays out fine. It's just the carb cycling took a little bit to get used to, because I don't think people, unless they do it, they don't understand after you get through the fugly phase, right? So you're fat, right? So I'm just going to be honest here. Somebody that starts dieting, maybe they actually think they look better than they do. So in a shirt or hoodie, they look good. And then they start dieting, and maybe they drop about 5 or 6%. And I'm talking if you're 18, 19, 20% type range. And then it's like, you look and you're like, oh, fuck. Because you're losing muscle glycogen, you're losing all this other stuff, and you're in this fucking ugly phase. And you're like, this is horrible. Once you get through that, and that was hard, that he kind of had to explain to me a little bit, because I'm like, what the fuck, man? I'm losing muscle, I'm getting fatter, and it's like, just let it roll. Too low. Where my point is when you start putting 2 low days together, or if things are a little behind, you might get 3 low. People don't understand what that 3rd low day is like. It fucking sucks. That took a little getting used to, because when you think that you got your mind and your discipline wrapped around what you're doing, it gets challenged with that. But then after a few times, you kind of know. Then you realize that, because when that happens, you're like, man, I got a high day coming up. This is going to be great. Then you realize you're farting all day. It's not as great as you thought it was going to be. So yeah,
the skinny, the fugly phase, I call it the skinny fat phase. Look, that's why so many perma-bulkers never get lean, because the worse you're going to look is the early stages of a diet, and so you can kind of analyze what happens. What are you in the off season? You're stuffed with glycogen. There's so much water and fullness in the muscles, and that looks like muscle. Because how can you tell the difference? If I cut my bicep out of my arm and I inject it with a bunch of fluid and it plumps up, how does that not muscle? There's not contractile tissue in there, but that muscle is bigger. And like, you can think of a steak versus beef jerky. If you dehydrate steak down to beef jerky, that beef jerky is the muscle. Everything else that plumps up to form the steak isn't actual muscle. It's all the other stuff in there, water and things like that. So when you first start dieting, you lose that. You lose that glycogen in the muscle. So you're a smaller, softer version of yourself, but you haven't had the time to burn the fat yet. So, and that's a mind fuck for people. A lot of people can never get past that phase. Once you get past that phase and you start getting leaner, because that phase only lasts until you get depleted. You can't get past depleted, And then even better, once you get past that phase, then that's your new baseline. Depleted is your new baseline. And then you start doing the high carb days and you fill back out. And so it actually kind of reverses. And then you'll have points where you're getting leaner body fat wise, and then you get filled out a little bit on those high days. And so you get a dramatic reversal in the opposite direction, where now you look bigger and leaner. But it's hard to get to that point, especially if you've never dieted before.
If I ever needed a coach for anything in my life, it was probably then, right? Because because you're like, well, fuck this, just turn it the other way, kind of go that way. But committing to the process, I guess, was kind of part of it too. But yeah, I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that this is, I'm like, this is bullshit, man. I just flip this back around, start carving back up and fill back up, and it'll be better. But
yeah, Dani, did you have sort of those moments in time?
Oh man, so many. And like, if you don't trust your coach and you don't know that
you
he's
weren't
awesome,
that fat though.
So I started.
I guess everybody's going to go through it though, no matter where you're starting.
Right. Well, and especially, so I started with Justin, probably the most detrained I've ever been. It was so I tore the adductor, and then I had the year of like the seizures and the weird, like couldn't really do much of anything. And like, I remember taking my first check-in pictures and being like, oh my God, I don't look like I've ever touched a weight in my life. And if you're someone who's trained for an appreciable amount of time, it's a pride point to not be normal, right? Like you're kind of like, I'm atypical. This is great. I don't want to be normal. And sending those first set of check-in pictures, it was tough. But then like as you go through the prep process and even like the fluctuations, once you do get past that skinny fat, this feels awful phase, just seeing how much your body like cycles throughout the week from the flatness, the fullness, and everything else, and like the leaner you get, the cooler it gets too. And everyone always says it, but you don't appreciate it until you've been in it.
Yeah, it's a little ridiculous. Like when I tell people when they look at the wall up there, I'm like, you gotta understand those jacked pictures. That was like one day.
Yeah.
You know, the other week is like the really skinny fucking things that you see up there. That was that.
Yeah, my favorite is when you get pictures taken like in a photo shoot or something like that, and someone sees that and like, oh my god, you look amazing. You're like, well, now I'm in the off season. So.
Yeah, and then it's like you have no idea how much like shit I felt when that photo shoot.
Look like Tarzan, feel like Jane. That's
I remember, so at university, I didn't really have a great routine together. I didn't know how I was going to do, and ended up winning my class, which is great, but I didn't really have like a night routine plan. And so I was backstage like trying to figure out like what to do. I was like, oh, I have a song picked out, that's good. And I was just backstage trying not to tear something, like going through some poses and, but being that depleted and that dry, it's unlike anything that I think most people will ever feel.
Yeah,
it's interesting if you've never done it before to see how much your body changes, because those changes are going on all the time. You just typically have enough fluff that you don't notice it. And that's actually one of the gauges, because I always tell people to like a certain level of body fat, but you can't measure body fat, and whether you do calipers or hydrostatic or in-body scan, they all give different numbers. And so like for an off-season body fat, a good range is when you're dieting and you notice how some days you're more bloated or holding water or flat, and you can see all those things, you should still be able to see that in the off season. If you can't tell days you're holding water versus not holding water, that means there's too much body fat covering so that's really the best gauge. But it's really like when all that fat's gone and you can see the water fluctuations in full effect, it's really insane how much the body changes every day, all day, that we're not even noticing because, we got fluff going on.
Yeah, now how long would it take someone to deplete themselves of glycogen enough to kind of start?
It's hard to know because you're never going to go zero carb, and even if you go zero carb, you're not going zero carb because most of the protein we eat gets used as a carb eventually. It gets converted to that. So you can you could do a mathematical formula like we said yesterday. Like a larger male that trains hard might be able to store 1,000 grams of glycogen. So you can kind of take the calories from that, how big of a calorie deficit they're in, and say maybe they're losing 50% fat, 50% glycogen, and kind of estimate it. But I never do that because I'm not trying to get you depleted. We're actually trying to do the opposite, keep you from getting depleted. There's just no way to be in a deficit and not lose glycogen. We want to maximize how many of the calories that we're deficient of that comes from stored body fat, but your body's always going to lose glycogen, and it wants to lose glycogen first. So you're actually not trying to get depleted, but by week 4 or 6, there's no way to avoid. You're going to be depleted. Will you do the high carb days to try to bring you back to life? But you're going to spend much of your time depleted by that point.
I circle back to the carbohydrates and protein being, protein sparing, because when I talk to people about protein intake and stuff like that, I'll ask them, what's your carbs? And if I have 600 grams, okay, then you only need like 15 grams. So expand on that a little bit. So you can explain it better than what I do.
Well, you can just do we did the math yesterday. You can do the math. So, we know what a pound is. It's like roughly 500 grams. So you could say, that's it. I start every sentence with so, and the way I realize is my 6-year-old comes up and she says anything. She goes, so, and then starts, and I thought, like, where's she getting that from? And
I write it.
Yeah. Do you? So it turns out I realized.
I'll start sentences with it.
Yeah.
Comma.
Yep. And I now that I notice it, I start every sentence with so. So anyways, if you take that out and you say, I want to gain 20 pounds of muscle in a year, and you break that 20 pounds, put it into grams, or that 10,000 grams, and you divide that by 365, and doing this quickly in my head, so I might be off.
Yeah.
It's like 25 grams a day. That's it. So to gain 20 pounds of muscle a year, it is like 25 or 30 grams of protein per day. That's like a gram per hour. That's it. So any more than that, that protein is not getting turned to muscle. At best, you're turning 1 gram of protein per hour to muscle. So if you eat 50 grams every 3 hours, what happens to the rest of that? it's not turning to muscle, and you think, yeah, screw that, I'm turning it to muscle. Well, calculate it out. Do 500 grams is a pound. If you're eating 500 grams of protein a day and gaining less than 365 pounds of muscle a year, you're not using, no one ever does the numbers on it. So that's really all it is. So what happens to the rest of it? Well, gluconeogenesis, which is just, a descriptive term. Glucose, new, genesis, create. So you're creating glucose from the protein you eat. And most of the protein we eat goes through that. So that's why when you ask how many carbs we're eating, why? Because the carbs, if there's carbs available, it's more likely that protein is not going to go through that, and it's more likely that that 1 gram is going to be able to be converted to muscle.
Yes.
And even more so, carbs. So carbs raise insulin, and people say insulin's the most anabolic hormone. It's really not. Insulin doesn't create anabolism, but it facilitates it. One, it's anti-catabolic. If insulin's bound to a cell, that cell can't catabolize calories. It can't go the other way. But more than that, when insulin's bound to a receptor on a cell, it kind of opens up a gate, like a floodgate, where it drives more amino acids. The amino acid uptake increases into that cell. So even more so than meaning you don't need to use that protein for carbs, it also increases the likelihood that those amino acids are going to flood into the muscle cell and get used to actually build muscle. So that gets missed. And people say it like, carbs are muscle sparing or protein sparing, but no one ever really thinks how or why, and that's why.
Now, if the carbs are low, then essentially you're going to be using the protein as a very expensive energy source.
Yep, and you're going to smell it too if you smell like ammonia.
Yeah, it pops the nitrogen off, converts. That's that glycogenesis or glucogenesis. So that's.
Now, one of the things that we talked about as well is that just sounds to me like you're just trying to create the environment where your body is making the choice to kind of go this direction, right? So every day you're just trying to do whatever it needs to do to make that body the state. It's almost like fertilize the ground for this growth to happen, right? The same thing with training, right? Like we were talking about how to like go on every set to failure, going crazy all the time in the gym, and then it's like what you're really trying to do is just cross that threshold into, okay, now your body's doing this process, and now you get the fuck out, right? Okay.
Well, exactly. And what you're saying there is I'm going to jump in here and kind of hijack it for a minute, but what you're saying here is what we're saying is nutrition is important, right? If you really want to make it simplified. But what people I don't think understand if they're always overweight, just heavy or whatever it is, they're eating so much shit, right? That within the shit, they're covering their bases with the protein and everything else. So they can sit there and say, powerlifters, for example, strongmen, oh, it's not that important. I've never worried about it. Well, you're eating 4,000 calories. You're covering these bases with the crap that you have. Strip that away and get close to a calorie maintenance or a calorie deficit. And now you don't have those extra padded calories. So now it becomes way more important on what your nutritional density is. Right? But it's still important, even for the super heavyweight powerlifter, it's still important. Maybe not all of it, right? But they got to cover those minimum bases of the carbohydrate, the fats, and the protein.
You can think of like filling up a cup of water. If you put a cup of water out in the rain, it'll eventually get filled up. But the rain's dumping 1 million pounds of water on this, in the city. So if you have 1 million pounds of water, we can fill that cup up with not worrying about anything. But if you only have 6 ounces of water and you need to fill that cup up, you need to make sure it's pouring right into the cup.
That's perfect.
Yeah, so that like the lower weight classes, it's really, and as a general rule, training and nutrition you really need to define what I'm doing it for. I always say training is for performance primarily. And I'll use an example of Daniel Cormier in the UFC, former UFC heavyweight champion and light heavyweight champion, and Tyson Fury, boxing champion. You can look like that and be the best boxer in the world because the training is performance. Now, nutrition is involved in performance, but like you said, at his size, he can pour the rainwater on it and he'll cover the nutrition bases. But it's how you look is nutrition. The training obviously is involved, but that's why you can get a Tyson Fury as a heavyweight champion. You're not going to get a Tyson Fury as a middleweight champion, though, because at that point, there's no room for that extra body fat. There's no room to pour the rain.
Now, for all the trolls, we do understand there are food allergies and there's other things that can impact this. And we're talking very broad here, so.
I think it's always really interesting, too. You get these guys that think that if they really want to get big or put on size, like the powerlifter or strongman that's going through a hypertrophy phase, right? They think they need to eat so much. When, like, Justin, what's the actual scientific, like if you had to put a number on the grams of muscle gain?
Well, we did 20, so we want to gain 20 pounds of muscle a year. We said that was like 25 grams
Which is,
per day.
for most people, like very aggressive. Yeah.
A little bit.
Well, let's think about it. Yeah, that means if you train for 10 years, you gain 200 pounds of muscle. You know, and there's not many people walking around at 420 pounds shredded. So no one even gains that fast. But if theoretically someone could gain that fast long term, so this is like, even this is out of what's going to happen. Well, 25 grams of protein is 100 calories. If you can be, so you're not, this goes back to that dumping the rainwater thing, because you can't be precise to the calorie. But if you could, that's all you need is 100 extra calories of protein synthesis a day to gain faster than anyone's ever gained muscle long term.
It shocked me in the off season between myself and my husband. Obviously very different. He's what, 270, 275 now?
Yeah, right now, yeah.
I'm not, thank God. But like we always joked about, even in the off season, like we're set yet. Give me some Twinkies, we'll see what happens. Cake goes a long way too. We always joke in the off season, like right now, especially when the post show rebound's done, we're both deep in the off season, we're still hungry. Like we want to be able to eat more. So you see these powerlifters and strongmen thinking they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get real big and go through this 10-week hypertrophy phase. I'm like, you're gonna put on 1.5 pounds muscle? Maybe.
Yeah. That's why I don't like short, like Paul Borenson used to do those short things. Muscle growth is muscle growth is such a slow, difficult process. What you want to do is stay in that process as safely and healthy and long as possible, because that's the way to make large gains. It's like the stock market, you know. You can go out and try to, like, I don't know what, like those meme stops, you're like, you can try to nail the GameStop purchase and become a millionaire.
Oh God!
To the moon.
Yeah, there's like 2 people who did that. You know, everyone else fails at that.
Yeah.
All the rich people invested over 20 years and let that grow, and that's what you need to do. And so like and so people listening to this, especially clients of mine, are gonna be like, what's he talking about? Not eat a lot. I eat because I do push a lot of food, and that's for kind of a separate reason, because we can't be that precise, that 100 calorie super precision. So what's the best way around it? And I always say, adding muscle is a 2-step process. If you want to just break it down to what can't not work, there's 2 steps. 1, teach the body to eat more and more good, clean food without getting fat. So we're constantly trying to find what your limit is of calories of good food, clean food that we can eat without getting fat. And we're always looking to increase it. And then step 2 is in the gym, get stronger in a bodybuilding rep range. Now there's more involved, there's sarcoplasmic growth, there's pumping, but we can't, we just want to simplify what can we guarantee is going to keep us moving in the right direction. And so do those 2 things. And you say, well, how do I know that's going to work? Well, if you're eating 7,000 calories a day, not fat and strong as fuck, you're going to be jacked. You are. You're not going to find someone who's eating 7,000 calories a day of chicken and rice, lean and strong as hell, who's small. It just doesn't happen. So that's the easiest path. Those 2 things that removes, then all the guesswork is out.
It was fun thinking about training. Just again, I think having worked with you now for 2 years, Dave and Dave have both taken on your training philosophy of like, just get really strong, work really hard, eat what you're told kind of thing. And it was fun prepping for this meet that I did in December, because I prepped really unconventionally from what a lot of people would do for meet prep. I would say it was pretty effective, but I stayed in that bodybuilding rep range. And like, did I get stronger? Yes. Did I maximize my potential for a meet? Probably not. But was I able to kind of play the card, or both, 2 sides of the coin there? And I would say it was pretty effective.
Yeah, how'd the meet go? I mean, I did 9 for 9 won. Yeah, I did pretty.
Yeah, I was a little conservative on a couple attempts, but 9 for 9 was good.
And the win was also good.
Yeah. Just getting back on the platform was awesome.
Now, in terms of you said bodybuilding rep ranges, I think if we can kind of break that down even as dumb as possible for people, it's like, what threshold do you need to cross over in the gym to make sure you're doing the right thing?
Yeah, and that's something I don't know that anyone knows. I don't know. I mean, I know there's, what happens, like how mTOR is involved in the process that stimulates, muscle protein synthesis, leucine is the amino acid trigger for that. So it's somewhere more. 1 rep's not doing it, or very much. And 50 reps isn't doing it. It's probably it's probably stimulating the highest level of muscle protein synthesis in like the 8 to 12 rep range, probably. But time under tension's involved in that. Mm-hmm. Are you pausing between each rep? From my not really science backed, although there is some evidence in EMG analysis of this type of training, I think the best training is essentially what Ronnie Coleman did, which if you watch the way he trained, it was bad form. We talked about this yesterday too. Bad form because he never locked out and he lifted explosively. But it appears, and there's some data to correlate with this, it appears that explosive concentric motion, not a lot of worry about the eccentric other than avoiding injury, and then constant tension on the muscle, which is how we train. You watch them do like shoulder press, it's this. Explosives up, not all the way lock out, and then somewhere in that, whether it's the reps or time under tension, that range, but for most people it's probably in that 8 to 12 rep range primarily, although you're going to want to spread it out overall. You know, you're going to want to go down to 5 to 6 reps sometimes. Certainly on certain movements like a deadlift, you're going to want to go down, but probably somewhere in that range.
It's really going to depend on the body part too. Like I think different body parts very much respond differently to different types of training, different stimuli, different rep ranges, just based on how like what actually makes up the muscle. So like we've talked about this before too, something like delts or your arms. They're not used, you know, for 1 or 2 heavy hard contractions. We use them all the time. And so there are certain muscle groups that I find tend to respond well to more of that kind of high rep range. And you'll see people take like rear delts into the 20, 30, 40, even to 50 rep range. And I think that at the end of the day, it's not that it doesn't matter, but are you doing something hard? Are you doing
Hard
something that's
work always
hard on
works.
the muscle?
Let's circle back to Ronnie just for all the people that are going to be making comments saying that's all bullshit, right? Because Stan and I talked about Ronnie just a little bit. I may be wrong on what I'm going to say here, but I don't think I am. How healthy are his shoulders? I don't think he's ever had a shoulder surgery.
No.
What about his elbows?
Same.
Never had an elbow surgery. What about his knees?
Same.
Never had knee surgery, right? So we're talking about low back is the biggest culprit, which probably played a lot into his hips.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Now,
for
the
sure.
low back, if
Absolutely.
you look at the history, it was kind of a botched surgery to begin with. Now, when people are like, oh, his training's all fucked up, they're usually talking about the dumbbell presses, the bench presses, the incline presses. So I'm going to circle back and say, how many pec tears? How many tricep tears? What's his shoulders look like? What's his elbows look like? Because how come you're going to use him as the example of that training's all fucked up, but you're only talking about his back?
Yeah, and which all started from a heavy squat where he felt a pop and then like didn't treat it properly.
You see what I'm saying though? It's because it's like, oh, look at him, look at him, look at him. Or they'll say, well, look at Branch. And okay, let's look at Branch. Let's look at Johnny Jackson.
Or, well, Jay Cutler is an even better example because he lifted explosively, partial reps, you know, and trained a totally different style, much higher volume, but he still did that core of what I believe is the best, which is not locking out, explosive concentric motion, not a lot of care or of the eccentric other than, you know, avoiding injury. And he's like the textbook example of how you can work your way through extreme bodybuilding and come out healthy on the other side.
But it totally makes sense if you think about it. I mean, in order to have that kind of force production for explosiveness, there has to be coordination on a small scale level, right? So you think about something like a shoulder joint where there are a whole bunch of small muscles that have to work together to coordinate to stabilize the ball in the socket. If you're going to be able to produce force quickly and explosively, there has to be a prerequisite level of coordination across the joint, not just that joint, but probably below it for the stabilizing structures. So of course it makes sense that, if he's not locking out all the way when he's relying on, joints to hold the weight, but he's actually putting that tension through the muscle to support the joints, absolutely makes sense.
And I think the form thing, I think, is the worst debate because it's the wrong things are being argued. Because if you go on the internet, and good form on the internet is 2 seconds up, lock out, 4 seconds down. And you're not going to get hurt doing that form. You're not. But it's good form, meaning like pretty much you're not going to get hurt because you can't use any weight. You know.
Yeah, you're not going to really get stronger either.
So is good form just mean like very low risk of injury, or is good form what's creating hypertrophy? And if you go on the internet, all the really, really huge dudes, if you go to the comments, are apparently using terrible form.
Yeah.
And all the people using good form are all really, really small dudes or chicks. So I think it's the wrong argument. Like, what is good? Are we doing it for hypertrophy because that's what good form is to me? Or and you have to also, if I'm doing it for powerlifting, good form is I move the weight from A to B within the rules of that federation
With
or that lift.
efficiency.
Yeah.
And that, what you had mentioned, Dani, about the coordination, right? Like, I think something that's important too is in terms of technique is there is a prerequisite of skill that they need, like within the movement, right? The technique and whatnot. But we had a conversation based on like, your body is fucking way smarter than, everybody's body is way smarter than we are, right? It's like, you can try to outthink your body, but if you put your body in a position, it, for the most part, for most people, will do the thing it needs to do to stabilize that position.
Well, Justin's a great example. I mean, he was doing a row movement, and the first thing that came on for him was his anterior delt. If you look at a textbook, of course, I'd be like, oh, well, that shouldn't happen. He's rowing. It should be his upper back. But the fact of the matter is he has a long history of being a very strong presser. He sits at a computer most of the day. He has a neurogenic amount of tension where, like, this is his body's reference center. And your brain is always going to look to keep you safe, and it's always going to look to produce force from a neurologic reference center from which it feels stable and good to go. So if you're constantly referencing on a kind of, again, neurological level here, your brain will consistently choose that.
And it's like the idea that those motion capture suits, right? It's like all these little balls all over your body, and it kind of it puts all that information back into the system to show the picture of what's going on.
Right.
You're always trying to understand where you are in space. You're always trying to understand like where the danger is coming from, right?
Right. Well, I think the big thing with that is, as an athlete, as a coach, you can't assume. You really can't assume very much. You can't assume much about a movement pattern. You can't assume that an athlete is going to feel something where they should be. It can look like they will, or they should, but proprioception can be very, very important. Again, I talk to a lot of people who don't work like textbooks. So someone might look like they should be getting a glute working, doesn't mean it is. And that proprioception can be hugely important in continuing to drive the rest of the training. And if you extrapolate that over time, that's going to culminate in, again, hypertrophy. So hypertrophy tells us use more than anything.
So what would be the environment that hypertrophy needs to have to happen? Like, what are the key factors of that people need to kind of focus in on when they're training? I
think if we were going to take a movement and ask the question of like what makes a movement a good hypertrophy movement, there are pillars, right? And Joe Bennett's talked about this a lot. But I'll talk about joint alignment. He'll talk about making sure that the actual loading profile in the movement is appropriate for where you're trying to overload the muscle within the range, right? He'll talk about stability and bracing, meaning how stable you are is going to obviously allow you to produce more force. But the element that I would add on are anthropometrics, because your individual makeup, someone who's got super long femurs, isn't going to be able to benefit from something, or not benefit well anyway, from something like a back squat, or someone who's got short femurs, where they're going to have different range of motion. So you even look at guys like, Mike Israetel, and he can press super, super deep on the leg press. But I take his leg press and I put it up next to my husband's, totally different anthropometrics. If my husband tries to go to that deep in his press, he's borrowing motion from somewhere, or he's cranking on his hip joint. So I think when it comes down to creating an environment for hypertrophy, those pillars have to be absolutely maximized. And the thing is, you can't make yours look just like someone else's. And in fact, that was probably how my big adductor injury happened, was I was trying to squat like someone else, which is dumb, but I think you'd know better.
I think people don't realize how involved and complicated movements really are.
Yeah.
And so I always try to explain it as, I don't describe a movement as describing the mechanical motion, because it's too hard to get that correct. So like we were saying yesterday, like working the lateral delts, the meathead of the deltoid, there's no one correct form for a lateral raise. If you're trying to create tension on that muscle, the correct form is whatever puts tension on that muscle. And so that's really what you need to be focused on. This is different than if you're training for a movement. Like the best movement for a squat is what keeps you within the rules of what a squat is in a in powerlifting. If you're training squats for quads, it's different. But if you want to know like how complicated it is and why it's so difficult to explain as far as biomechanical movement patterns, you remember like in physics class when you try to find the torque on like a bar of length L? That's one bar of length L with one torque, and people got that wrong. All that. Well, now how many muscles are in the legs? And so when you're doing a squat, how many bars are there of different lengths and thicknesses, and they're all different for each person. So you got all the muscles of the quads, the adductors, the sartorius, the hips, the hip flexors, your glutes, your lower back, and all of those have different lengths for each person, and probably even each leg on you. And so you're to try to to call just one movement that's correct for all those and is going to be correct for all people is impossible.
Well, I think even beyond that too, if you take that a step further and think about all those muscles, if we actually stop and fully appreciate the fact that none of these muscles run in just a straight, point A to point B line. They're three-dimensional. And if we don't stop and actually appreciate that, in addition to something like some of the joint kinematics. So, as you go through a squat, the head of your femur, the hip has to rotate within the socket, which is going to change some of the relative rotational demand. And so you really can't isolate all these variables like you were saying. And I think, the more people are exposed to different thought processes on social media, the more confounded and muddy the waters become. And I really, really hope that at the end of the day, people can start to take a little bit of ownership of learning what works for them and recognize that it's probably not going to be what's popular on social media. And that's fine. You have to
you have to make sure you're asking the right question too,
ask one more question. Yeah. Once you ask the right one, ask another.
Because people say, you know, the best form on squat. Well, what are you doing the squat for? Are you a rugby player? Are you a power lifter? Are you lifting in triple ply gear? Are you raw? Are you wearing knee wraps? Are you doing squats to train your quads? What, you know, because all of those are different. If I'm trying to build really big quads, my squat is different than if I'm wearing a triple ply suit in a powerlifting meet, which is different than if I'm doing a raw squat with knee wraps. That's different than if I'm doing a raw squat without knee wraps. So they're all different. They're different questions because they're looking for a different answer. And people don't do that. They just say, what's the best squat form?
Right.
I think if you take powerlifting out of the discussion, because that can muddy the waters of what I'm going to say right here. I've always told people, going back to when I was still personal training people, is I wanted my clients to do isolation movements, which everybody is like, what the hell are you doing that for? Like, I want them to do a concentration curl so they feel what their bicep feels like when it's burning and it has, you know, that feel. Like, they're not going to get a pump. They're not going to know what a pump is. I just want them to feel what that feels like. And I think that with most of the people that are going to be listening to this, if I tell you, or even if I tell Sam, who you guys you've been doing this for a long fucking time too. So he's like 40 years.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But if I tell him like, hey, here's this chest exercise over here, say it's some cable machine, you know, when he starts doing that, he's going to start manipulating things to be able to flex his chest harder, to find the right end range where he has that stretch that he's looking for. And then he'll determine what tempo he needs based upon because he knows what the chest feels like when it's going through movement. Most people that are going to be listening to this don't even know that. So if we take the movements and say the squat and the quads is a great one. Let's just take the squat out of the program for a while. Just do some fucking leg extensions and feel your quads burn, right? So if you're going to squat and you're going to focus on your quads, it's not going to feel that same way, but try to at least feel the tension in your quads, right? Because they don't even know, right? Now, powerlifting wise, I don't want them to know. I want it to move as a unit, right? Not independently, but as a unit. And I think that the compound lifts, it's going to sound really weird, man. The compound lifts get overemphasized with the beginners and the intermediates.
Actually, that's really,
right?
I never thought about that, but yeah, that's how training is presented to beginners, is all compound movement. Yeah, and you're probably working with someone who has so little body awareness, unless they were a gymnast or a high-level athlete, which if they're a gymnast or high-level athlete, they've already been training. They're not a beginner. So any beginner has no kinesthetic awareness.
Yes.
I've never even thought about
So take
that
a bent over barbell row, right? Say you at your strongest, you can find you 405, 455, right? And just crank them out.
I have a video of 495.
495 there, so 500 pounds.
Why not
right?
500?
Yes. Well, because it's 5 plates.
Was that
I get that.
Justin?
I get that.
Did you just row 495 yesterday when we were deadlifting?
Yeah, pretty sure.
He knew where his hands went.
They're working on the Photoshop.
Yeah. But let's say that you do that 1 week, then a couple weeks later you're thrown back in your program and your back just don't feel right. You're like, fuck it, I'm just going to use 225. You're going to change things. You're going to change the tempo. You're going to change the speed. You're going to flex harder. You're going to hold it harder. And you can find a way to get maybe not as much, but a lot more out of that because you know what it's supposed to feel like. Where if it's a chest supported row, for instance, a lot of people that will come out, I can see immediately, especially the people that come out with Meadows, it's so rear delt dominated. It's like but I can tell them, get it here. And then just one shift, bam, there it is. You bring somebody out that's an intermediate or a beginner, you can't do that. It's like, okay, let's go do a 1 arm lat pull down, or let's go do a dumbbell row and just focus on squeezing those lats. Then we can get into that conversation that we're talking about. Are you actually doing that? Because when you start pushing the weights heavier and heavier at that level, they will start compensating with muscles that are going to take over that are stronger.
I think, I think a good tie-in with that is even for advanced lifters, if you want, I think a good technique to know whether you know how to work the correct muscles is take whatever movement you're doing, like a bent over row, reduce the weight by 10 or 20%, and find a way to make it as hard, because you can if you're
make it harder.
Yeah, but because if you're rowing 405, you're involving other muscle groups. So,
of course,
whatever your main muscle isn't doing all 405 pounds of it. So you should be able to drop it down to 365 and make it at least as hard by reducing the output from the muscles you're not intending to work. And Jay Cutler used to do that all the time. He would never put the whole stack on any cable machine. he would always go down one and make it as hard as the whole stack, which I always thought was like a really clever way of forcing load on the correct muscles.
So now with that in mind, go back and look at some of those training videos of Ronnie when he's doing the dumbbell presses, and you can see, because he's got such insane muscle bellies, you can see this is his pecs jamming this up, and there's some tricep and there's some delt movement, but you can definitely see what's doing the majority of that work with that, just on that nature.
Yeah, and I think, and Dani, I'm going to want you to dig a little deeper on this subject matter, but you need to, if you're working with a beginner, if you're working with somebody who's less advanced, you need to expose them to that language, right? If a compound movement is an example of, if I'm trying to learn Spanish, right? A compound movement may be like a sentence. If I'm brand new to that, I don't know what the fuck's going on. Like, I don't even know what each individual word means on its own. Right? So you almost need to break it down to its most basic parts. And that's why I really like that, the perception of starting with an isolation movement to give them that feeling, to that sensation or that language that they can then communicate with, to create, a more complex movement, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking and listening to you talk, Dave, and thinking about Ronnie too. I had a clinical mentor of mine who gave me the phrase that you can't strengthen what you can't find.
That's a good point.
And I love that. Right. And so if you think about, the spectrum of lifters, you've got the beginners who really just need to learn their basic vocabulary, but you also have the really advanced lifters. And I tend to find that people who actually have a harder time finding things are typically one or the other. People who are kind of in the middle of the spectrum, they can find what they need to find. But you take a really advanced lifter who's trained for a very long time in very different patterns. Yeah, you see where I'm going with that.
That's harder.
It's so hard.
It's harder than the beginner.
That's where I get a lot of those. And so that's where you start to even use things like isometrics, and you get these guys who've been training for a long time and they're like, what do you mean this is all you want me to do?
Yeah, palpitations help, isometrics help, anything. It's crazy, man.
Well, the analogy that I use a lot is like if you walk into a room full of people talking, let's say there are like 15 people in a room talking, right? And your wife, your best friend, someone is in there that you talk to all the time. You can walk into that room with all those conversations going on, and you can pick out their voice quickly. And our brain is very much the same way, and these motor patterns that we have, our prefrontal cortex loves to choose the things we're good at. And so if you've communicated with a group of muscles a ton, or not at all, you need to change that communication and bring up the vocabulary, at least get them speaking the same language before you can really start to develop. So even with bodybuilding, you look at people who have very, very underdeveloped regions, and you ask them when's the last time they felt that, and this, they're going to say never. But they might be a really advanced lifter. And sometimes peeling off some of those layers and asking the question of why, even for a very advanced lifter, you have to come back to a lot of the basics.
I've had luck with, in that case, in that situation, taking from the powerlifting side, say if it's a squat or something, just removing it from the program for an insane amount of time, like 3 or 4 months. And so they almost forget what the hell they're doing. So they come back and it's so foreign, then you can address it. I'm not going to say this always works. I mean, it's like 40% of the time it will work. But I mean, what are you going to do though? Because that's a tough one, man. It's a really, really tough one, especially if you don't see the person all the time.
Right. Well, I'll use myself as an example just because I can talk about it from both the third person as well as first person component with something like the squat for powerlifting and having transitioned to bodybuilding. I can't remember the last time I actually felt my legs in a squat with powerlifting.
You shouldn't.
Right.
I mean, I'll argue you should.
I'm like, oh, cool.
You should feel
right. my back feels tight as fuck. But
yeah.
And transitioning to bodybuilding, I felt like I had massive weaknesses in my quads, and it was like because I never used them. But being able to not squat, having to not squat, not by choice, and using different implements to actually improve that proprioception, along with structuring my sessions in a way that permitted more force production with some post-activation potentiation, for the first time ever, I actually felt my quads. Squatting.
Yeah.
But it was always in a higher rep range. It was still heavy. It's just fascinating to me where you get these advanced lifters who really have no idea how to use certain muscles, or they don't know if it's important to.
Yeah. I mean, if it's a former powerlifter and say they want to convert into bodybuilder, you've had tons of those, right? I probably wouldn't even have them squat. So
I don't. I think 100%. And I think that's a perfect example, because anyone who's a powerlifter, because the squat, this is a more generalized thing, but you look at powerlifters, and I think I talked about this in the last table talk even, they almost always have big chests and thick backs. And why? Well, on a deadlift. Other muscles are involved. The hamstrings work, the glutes work. But if you're using the hamstrings as a prime mover, you're not going to get as strong as you can possibly get on a deadlift. So the only way to get as strong as possible on the deadlift and continue getting stronger is to use your back as the primary torque tool. Same with bench. Your triceps and delts are involved, but you're not going to be the best bencher you could be. The only way to continue to get stronger is to optimally use your chest. Squat's different. The way to get stronger on squat is to use less quads and spread it out over more muscles. And if you get really good at that and be a top powerlifter, it's going to be hard to come back and change that squat into a quad movement, because the only way you could get good at squatting from a powerlifting standpoint is to not be quad dominant.
One of the biggest things that I saw when John Meadows was out here and you guys were working on deadlifts, it was like you kept saying you deadlift like a bodybuilder, and you do too.
We had that. Yeah. That was so fun to see yesterday, because we did. So we took Justin through. Hopefully, this will go up on film too. But
absolutely.
We took Justin through a pull down movement. I'm watching Justin literally like use his lats to extend his spine. I'm like, no wonder his lats are enormous. Like, but you watch him deadlift, and he actually finishes his deadlift like he's doing the end range of a pull down, leaning back. Yeah. Like he finishes his deadlift.
I call it the bodybuilding deadlift. They're flexing their lats.
Ben Pollock used to say I deadlift like a bodybuilder too. I was like, what does that mean?
And one of the things that when we were working together that I think is really, really helpful is how you cued things to me, right? So you would just say, find your oblique, or find your abs, or find your, and you didn't say, do this to make this happen. You allowed me to take a second and to kind of organize myself in a way to find that outcome. And you would be just kind of facilitating that.
Well, it's partially self-serving because I want to see how you do it.
Right.
I mean, I could give you a cue to execute something, but that's going to be totally inorganic to how you may otherwise choose to do the movement. And I'm very interested in what happens before you get that muscle group working. If I say, hey, give me a little bit of left ab wall, and I see a whole bunch of this happening, I'm like, okay, he can't find his abs without this other program happening. And I think, again, we as coaches is like, we want a cue. And I can do that with you because you're an advanced athlete, right? Like I can't do that with everybody.
No, for sure. But I appreciate, I just as someone who is very aware of like how my body feels, or I thought I was aware of how my body felt, to be given that space to organize, I think is really, really important. And as a cue, I'll be using more as I work with the people I work with as well, because the result was a sensation that I was learning and I was feeling, and that I will not forget, right? Because you allowed that growth and that, space to figure it out. And that was all it was, right? I was just trying to figure it out. Yeah.
And I think that goes for a lot of things too, whether it's PT or training or, nutrition and diet. If you're told how to do something, you're so concerned about doing it right. There's not a lot of ownership in the process, right?
There needs to be ownership.
Yeah,
and that's what I mean. You may do it, but when we were working together, I had ownership of making the fucking meal. Here were the 7 macronutrient profiles, right? Here's meal 1, here's meal 2, here's meal 3, and then here's the carbs, protein, whatever it was for that week. Here's the foods. Figure it out. I like that, right? Because it gives me the freedom of that choice. But the other thing that does is it's educating me, or re-educating me, because I knew this before, but when you're a fat powerlifter for 20 years, you forget it. Then you start then it's like, oh, okay, a chicken breast is, 4 ounces of chicken breast is 10 grams of protein, or whatever the fuck it was. Now I've forgotten it all again. But you start to learn and internalize and remember, or when I was create a mental food bank, right? So then if you don't have the stuff and you got to like wing it, this is equal to this, this is equal to this.
And I'll try to jump in, but that's 100% why I do it. And because the people who give only foods will say, well, they're being more precise because I'm telling them exactly what to eat, and that they think they are. And I think Patrick Tour said this, but you have to understand your clients will lie to you, and they will. And I can think of several examples. Actually, a person who lives in Michigan who I did a workout with, who was working with a coach who gave them exact meals. And whatever their post-workout meal was supposed to be, he didn't have those foods available to him. So what did he do? He ordered like pizza.
Yeah.
And so
same thing.
Exact opposite.
Same thing.
Well, he didn't know, and so I was like, well, what are you supposed to eat? And he's like, well, a banana and a cup of oats. And I was like, well, that's this many carbs in this. He's like, well, I don't know. How do you know that? He didn't, because he doesn't know anything about nutrition. And so you think you're being more precise, So even if that only happens once in off season, one time, the difference in calories from that pizza that varied from what its plan was supposed to be is going to be way bigger than the entire off season of the way I do it, where you think it's less precise.
Yeah.
It's just not, because you have to, humans aren't robots. If you were feeding a robot, you could say that, because they don't have taste buds, the food is there when you supply it to them, but humans aren't robots. You have to find something that what actually increases precision is not what you think it is at first glance, because it's the edge cases like that really throw things off. So no matter how precise everything was, that 2,000 calories off plan is way more than the calorie here that mine might not account for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's funny because in the sporting world, right, there's an example for, I know everybody here is big golfers, but when you're learning to putt, one of the biggest things that you want to do is not stare directly at the hole. Is you want to pretend like, okay, the hole's this big and you just want to get it relatively close, right? And if you can get it relatively close for longer periods of time, you're going to get better at doing that thing, right? You're going to get better at putting, or you're going to get better at picking the meals or picking, you know what I mean? Making those decisions. If you make the target this super tiny, aim small, miss small, you know what I mean? Like there's all these variables that happen in life because you said humans aren't robots, right? But you both allow for the discovery process, like the internal discovery process. If you said chicken breast or go fuck yourself, and then someone's like, yeah, but I had the same in 96.4 beef and I love it and I get excited to eat. It's like, that's a better outcome.
And the consistency is what matters anyways. Most people stick to the same foods. They're going to stick to the foods they like. So even this variation that I talk about by allowing them different foods, that's not what happens. They eat the same foods. It might sound like, now they can, they don't. They stick to the same foods. So what ends up happening is now we are super precise because they're sticking to the same foods, and the only time they differ, rather than differing by a pizza, they're differing by switching 96.4 ground beef to chicken, in one meal because they didn't have 96.4. But because there's that consistency, now we don't even need to worry about calories really, because they're eating the same thing every day. So now I know if they're not dropping fat, whatever calorie count they're at, if I take their diet minus X amount of macros, I know I get that X amount of macros now linear differentiation. That's so it's the consistency that matters, you don't even need you get the worst thing with nutrition is people try to be so precise they get to make the precision higher than the natural variation in the foods already, and then that increases the variation.
Well, and I think the other component to that too with nutrition, but can be lateralized to so many other things, is there's a fine line between ownership and decision fatigue. And I think we as coaches and whatever it is we're doing need to do a really good job of walking that line. And I think that's part of why, at least as one of your athletes, I've loved the way that you set things up, because there's that ownership. But because there's some structure to it, I'm not sitting there staring at my fridge trying to macro Tetris and saying, oh my God, I'm over by 5 protein at the end of the day, which doesn't really matter. Yeah,
and to clarify, things have changed since we worked together. I do now include full meal plan. And so it's what I tell people is I have formulas like an Excel program that pulls data from the internet. Like it takes chicken and it normalizes whatever the data is, which could be wrong because I'm using Calorie King or whatever. But it normalizes for the macronutrient. It normalizes to how many ounces it takes to get 1 gram of protein, and then it multiplies that by however many protein you get in each meal, and it outputs a full meal plan. But I tell you, you can start with this, but these foods aren't going to change very often, if at all. And you need to know what to do if I have you eating chicken and oatmeal after a workout. What happens if you don't have chicken and oatmeal? You need to know how to do that, and that's why the macros come in.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see because I've done this. I've worked with nutrition coaches in the past, and at the end of the day, I was like, all right, I have 4 protein and 27 grams of fat. It's like, oh, fuck.
And the random 13 carbs.
Yeah, right. It's like, all right, well, I guess I'm eating olive oil now. There's just, to give, right? But I've done that shit. I'm just like, I got to be exact. So I know exactly what you mean with that because you start to obsess about the minutia, let alone, without looking at the big picture.
And the thing is, we like we just said, there isn't that minutia. Because you weren't as accurate as you thought you were. So you thought you can't get 13 grams. Yeah, right. 13 grams of what? Of rice? What was the climate when that rice was harvested? Was the air moisture? Because
you talked about the husks on the brown rice yesterday, and I was like, it blew my mind that you actually thought about how all the different ways that these foods can have variances.
Yeah. So you have oats. So a tin of oats. Well, what's the humidity of your home? Is it 60%? Because some of that moisture is going to get absorbed in the oats. So when you weigh 100 grams of oats on a humid day, it's different than 100 grams of oats when it's 10% humidity in the winter. You know, and that difference is more than a calorie, which is what you're trying to be precise to. You can't be precise to the calorie.
God, it blows my mind. I've spent so much time worrying about stupid shit.
Yeah.
Stupid shit.
And it's
just take the protein. How are you going to cook it?
Well,
where are you going to weigh it? Before you cook it or after? I mean, there's a lot of shit.
Well, like worrying about stupid shit. I have like a theory. So meat, you know, like the dumb meathead idea, and I think that's the stereotype for a reason. It's because the only people who succeed are the people who can get through this without overanalyzing and ruining it for themselves. I mean, that's really true. That's paralysis by analysis.
100%
yeah.
true.
That's the dumb meathead thing. It's because they're the only ones smart enough to get through without overthinking.
Well, it's funny. I mean, even seeing some of the questions that came in is the detail-oriented questions. It's like this one specific time in this one specific situation, what should I do? And it's like, well, step one, avoid that situation.
Yeah. Yeah, doctor,
right?
It hurts when I do this. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that thing, right? It's as someone who has gone through like multiple nutrition coaches, multiple like training coaches, and you know had worked with my own athletes. It's very reaffirming to hear. It's like, yep, it's the big rock still. Like it's still the big stuff, right?
Well, I mean, if you're talking athletes, so let's get out of the strength realm, right? You're dealing with high school kids. You're dealing with, you know, non-scholarship college kids. I mean, they don't know shit, you know, so you just got to start with, here's a complete protein, you know, it's just better food choices, because obviously we know the food guide pyramids for shit, right? And the emphasis put on health in this country, especially, has been horrid for God knows how long. Maybe it's changing, you know, I hope it changes because of the C thing. Right? Because, well, people are more aware now that the healthier you are, the better your immune system, you know. And I do think that that's an opportunity for the industry it's going to pop. It's going to grow, because on the back end of this, people are now thinking, oh, no, wait a minute. Most of the people that had bad issues here were obese. I don't want to be obese. And while we complain, there's been a lot of people over the last 2 years, lots of people that have lost hundreds of pounds, and, you know, let's say out of fear or whatever the fuck it was, but it's changing, which creates that, which means we'll start being approached more and more by the athletes, like you're talking about, the high school kids, and they're going to want to start training, they want to start being healthy. And the big rocks, like you said, that's where we need to focus, is on those big rocks and explaining to them what is a protein. You know, what don't eat shit in wrappers, you know, they just, you know, stuff like that, you know.
The nice thing is you get the biggest bang for your buck is the basics.
Yes.
Things. Like I always say, because I'm a proponent of intra-workout nutrition, you know, and they say, like, how much of a difference does it make? And I don't know what it is, 1%, 5%, but I do know that if it is even 5%, unless you're doing the other 95% perfect, that 5% doesn't matter, because that 95% is way bigger than 5%. And if you're doing that other 95% correct, you're not going to need to do the other 5% correct, because you got the big part correct.
Yeah, but the way that our industry works for the kids that I'm speaking about, and the beginners and stuff like that, the only thing that they're looking at from that nutritional perspective is probably a pre-workout with tons of stim.
Oh, yeah.
Like 1,000 milligrams of caffeine pre-workout, let's bust ass go. That's their supplement. You see what I'm saying? And I mean, we all do the same. I mean, we all do the same thing, right? But you understand what I'm saying, though. That's where the emphasis now is. That's where they all want to fall. Even my kid, who doesn't train that often at all, was taking pre-workouts for gaming. You know, it's like, okay, well, fuck, you know, wait a minute here, you know, and that conversation needs to pivot and say, well, maybe you don't need the pre-workout. Maybe what you need, you know, if you want to spend the money, is the intra. The intra, to me, is going to be more important than the pre-workout.
Oh, for sure. Well, you could even make an argument that the pre-workout is counterproductive.
We have.
If it gives you a better workout, great. But a lot of times it doesn't, and all it does is give you this external stimulus, which is going to increase your body's likelihood to burn muscle for energy. You know, you put yourself in a fight or flight response when it doesn't need to be. You know, if you're dragging ass, tired after the work day, and aren't going to get a good workout without a little kick, then it's useful. But if you're already ready to train and you're just doing it just to get high, it could be counterproductive.
It is. We did a whole video on this. It was one of the table talks that we did, one of the earlier ones. It was like 10 minutes of just taking the other side. Like, here's why pre-workouts suck. And it's exactly what he's saying right here. Yes, everything's got its place and its time, but it can be detrimental too. Because if you're from the strength world, getting out of the bodybuilding world, from the strength world, if you're pushing the end of that peak phase, and you have to have that to be able to get that training in, well, then the first thing I'm wondering is your recovery's off. And now you're going to do something that's going to put you even at more risk and pain pills would be the same way, so you have the pain pills, you have this. So now you have a very poor gauge as you're going through the heaviest time of your training. Your gauge of pain has been numbed. Your gauge of mental adrenaline, or whatever you want to call it, is enhanced. So how do you know? Are you ahead of progress, on progress, behind progress? And this matters for that powerlifter that's trying to peak. Because if you're behind, you got to kick your ass to get caught up, which is normally, that's not, from my experience, that's not the case. The case is they get ahead. And if they get ahead, you got to back it off, because then they get ahead, then you're just running into a problem. And they'll think, oh shit, I'm way stronger than I thought I was going to be. And then they just keep pumping.
Well, I think it goes back to, are you asking the right question?
Yeah.
Because, what am I using the pre-workout for? Now, if it's meet day and it's going to let you to be stronger, well, that we don't care if we lose muscle on meet day, because all we care about is the numbers on the platform. But, if I'm training, my goal is the future, not just this workout. I can have and so I do that with diet all the time. Like, people say it because I'll put my highest carb day on the day of a heavy workout. And people will be like, but I'll get a better leg workout if I have it the day before my leg workout. And I say, I know you will, but we're not doing it to have a good workout. We're doing it to maximize glycogen storage and protein synthesis from the workout. And as an example, I always use, this is an example in reverse, but if you were doing cardio to burn fat, you'd want to probably do it on an empty stomach. You wouldn't be drinking like those like sugar drinks or drinking Gatorade while you do your cardio, because it's going to blunt the fat burning.
Yeah.
But if you are running a marathon for a time, which is essentially cardio, you want that because you're trying to maximize how fast you can do the cardio. So what is your goal? If your goal from training is to build muscle or get stronger, then we want to make sure we're not doing anything that's going to inhibit that. And like the pre-workout could do that. Now, if your goal is for this day hit a number, then that's where it comes in.
And that's breaking the record book, like you're talking about, or a max effort day and stuff like that.
That's always a question of keeping the goal the goal. But if you don't stop long enough to actually ask yourself what that is, it's really hard to take that, bird's eye view of, are we actually going that direction? I think you have to do pretty consistent temperature checks with whatever it is you're training for.
And the pre-workout and stuff like should all be phasic anyhow.
Right.
There's going to be certain periods you're going to use it, certain periods. I mean, if you're off season and you're just doing conditioning work after a show or whatever.
And sometimes just taking a break just so you can get resensitized.
Well, hell yeah.
So
you're going to need 9,000 milligrams of caffeine after a while.
So what would you say is a very basic intra-workout that someone could take?
Preferably a high molecular weight carbohydrate, and it's not required, but the reason is that it doesn't pool water in your stomach. Now, if you're in prep and dieting, your gastric emptying rate is going to be so high, nothing sits in your stomach. Then it probably doesn't matter. You could probably use like a maltodextrin or a dextrose. But in the off season, when you're already kind of bloated, if you drink a dextrose, it's going to pool in your stomach. You're going to get bloated, and so you want a high molecular weight carbohydrate and then essential amino acids. Those two ingredients, bare bones, that's I think probably 90% of the effectiveness of the intra-workout is covered right there. The amino acids cover any protein synthesis that may be created by the workout in the immediate future while those amino acids are in the bloodstream. All the amino acids necessary for protein synthesis are there. And then the high molecular weight carbohydrate gives you a carbohydrate that gets to the small intestine really quickly, where it can start breaking off glucose molecules to keep blood sugar levels stable, so you're not breaking down liver glycogen to fuel your workout. And then also it's going to have that glucose in the bloodstream after the workout immediately to replenish the lost glycogen that you did lose. And those two things are 90% of it. On top of that, creatine is always a good product to add. I really don't even add much more onto that. There's lots of things that you can make an argument for about 20 other ingredients that all have kind of the same minimal improvement.
Now, Dani, do you use any sort of intra?
I do what boss tells me to do.
Hers, yeah, she just does the, I think like
Very
10 grams of EA.
Yeah, and we get the like super cheap Amazon brand
Yeah.
and a little Gatorade powder mixed in, diluted.
Beautiful. Perfect.
Diluted is important with the Gatorade powder because Gatorade at full strength. So when Gatorade was first, it's called Gatorade because it was developed by the Florida Gators sports science program. This is Gatorade. Well, the original Gatorade was much lower sugar. It's kind of like what the G2 Gatorade is right now.
Right.
Yeah, it didn't taste good.
Yeah, so they added sugar when they brought it to market because it tastes better. But when the sugar actually gets as high as the concentration in regular Gatorade at the dilution it's the molecular weight is too low, the osmolarity is too high. It doesn't create a pull of the fluid into the small intestine. Now you can get the reverse effect with high molecular weight carbohydrates are too diluted. You get actually too low of an osmolarity. You get something called dumping syndrome, which is exactly what it sounds like. All that water floods into the small intestine and colon, and you dump it.
Dumping.
Had that. Been there, done that.
So one of the other questions that we've seen quite a bit, and Dani, this one's going to be for you specifically, is you do such a good job bridging the gap between the clinical world and the performance world, right? How can someone find a clinician in their area or someone like you or you, right, to work with when it comes to an injury or a rehab or something? Because you always see that, right? Like for me personally, I had some pretty good PTs back in Rhode Island that I worked with, but other places aren't so fortunate to have that performance-minded person to help them, right? They'll just say, do 3 sets of 10 of this and call me in the morning, right?
Yeah. And there's a time and a place. We've done a lot better. There's a resource called theclinicalathlete.com that a lot of times will let you find a PT. But truthfully, I think the best thing that you can do for yourself as an athlete is learn your body. And that's kind of why I take the pedagogy that I do and teaching people not only to learn, but then to continue to teach. Because at some point, anything that we learn is going to trickle onto someone else. So I really honestly think that you can start with a couple of different things. Is number one, you need to be able to ask a question about, okay, well, squat hurts, why? Overhead pressing hurts, why? And just quite frankly, start exploring. And rather than looking for the quickest route from point A to point B, kind of take a step back approach and really let yourself kind of meander through that gray area. It's not comfortable. It's not fun. But you need to be able to, even if you don't end up trying to like fix yourself, the more you can articulate what it is that you're sensing, what you're feeling, where you're having issues, where you're struggling, the better someone else like myself will be able to help you. One of the first places that I like to start with people is really, really basic. I started there, was it you or Justin yesterday with range of motion?
Oh, that was me.
Super basic. You're like, yeah, I have some, limited range of motion. I was like, great, let's see how far you go. And we were able to take a lat movement, which should have been, a training stimulus, but we used that to actually improve your shoulder range of motion. So I don't think it's nearly as complicated as people, I don't think it's as complicated as it is often created to be. It's as simple or complex as we make it. But the first step is always going to be identifying, number one, biggest problem, and then finding a way to allow training to be the thing that actually rebuilds you and makes you better. Because any problem you have is probably indicative of, we talked about weak points, from either hypertrophy or functional standpoint. A lot of times they coincide.
Yeah, I think, well, that's, you're very good at this because you always start with questions, right? A lot of the times in your world, you can probably speak to this more so than anybody, is they have a playbook, right? It's like a rotator cuff playbook or a low back playbook where it's like, this is this A, B, C, D, grade this, cool, whatever. But if you're a strength athlete and you're in that realm, it's like, do you look for another PT or do you just ask that PT more questions and just try to get that information?
Yeah,
what would you say?
Let me make sure I understand the question the best so I can answer whoever asked. Is it more, how do I find help from someone, or how can I approach this myself?
How do I find help from somebody?
How do they reach you?
Let me hijack it while you're thinking.
Please do.
Okay. I'm going to preface this or preface this, however you're supposed to say it. Me and my learning disabilities. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not qualified to do any of this, but I have been hurt a lot and I've had to seek that attention a lot. And if I'm to give broad I can't say recommendations. If I'm to give personal anecdotal advice, if they accept insurance, I'm walking away. That's one of the big red flags that I have.
Absolutely.
Because if they're taking insurance, they're being paid for by the insurance company, not me. They don't work for me, they work for the insurance company. They're also restricted on the number of visits they're allowed to work with me with. They're also got to work with very, very specific billing codes. So if we have an issue that I'm contending with and the actual issue is upstream or downstream, they're running into an issue on how do I code this? How do I bill this? Because maybe I'm in there for the shoulder and the doctor wrote it for the shoulder. And then they go in there and they realize, okay, this is the elbow or whatever it's going to be. It's someplace else. So I'm so sick with all that. I'm just done with it. I just fucking no. I want, if I'm speaking to somebody, the first thing I want to hear out of their mouth is just to let you know, I don't accept insurance. Like, cool. How much is it? That way it gives me a ballpark, because the price can range greatly. That's kind of the first, for strength athletes. I'm not talking, I guess I could say for everybody, but for strength athletes, that's the first thing. The second thing you already tapped on a little bit, take ownership of what your problem is. Look it up. And granted, doctors are notorious for telling you not to Google things, right? I think that's the dumbest advice that you can have, because if you, fuck Google, if you DuckDuckGo it, right? So if you DuckDuckGo it, and then you're able to ask better questions. You're not doing this to be able to self-diagnose. You're doing this to be able to kind of get in the ballpark, kind of like you were talking about with the putting, right? Get in the ballpark. So then when you're having the conversation with Dani or somebody else, and then you can ask better questions, right? Just going in there like, oh, my arm hurts or my shoulder hurts. You're already, she's not a mind reader, she can't.
As far as you know.
Exactly. I mean, she can't get in the joint and all this other kind of stuff. You got to kind of have some of that in there. And those are two big ones, right? And then the other one would be, is this going to require any type of manual solution?
Manual work, yeah.
Yes, manual solution, right? Because sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. And then that's a whole different, because you're dealing into, dozens of, probably hundreds of different modalities that could be used for treatment or whatnot. Most of the time, I don't think that's the case. Most of the time, it's just, let's just zero in on the diagnosis, because if anything, and the imaging doesn't tell the whole story either. I'll let you touch on that a little bit more. But the imaging, yes, it's a good place, but it doesn't tell the whole story with that. Then the other thing you have to watch is wherever you go, whatever that practitioner is, not everybody, but most of them have very strong biases. Go to a chiropractor, there's their bias. You go to an orthopedic, there's their bias. They all can be right, because there's a lot of different roads to get, to the same outcome. But what you want to find is somebody that kind of has a broad overview of all of them. So then you have like the quarterback, and it says, okay, here's what I am. I know these things. This is a little bit out of my realm. Go here, right? And then they can say, go do dry needling or stem cells or, whatever that area is going to be. And if it's a one-stop shop, leave, because you suck at everything. And so I gave you enough time to think.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here listening, and I agree with everything. And I think the hard thing about this is that the best clinicians and the people who are best at getting you, I don't want to say like fixed up, because I truly don't believe that we're broken. I think we have accommodations. The people who are best at getting you fixed up are probably so busy actually helping people that they're not going to have the loudest voices on social media. And so we get on social media, and these people come out with these very, very broad,
let me jump in there real quick.
Yeah.
How do I want to say this?
Did he just get kind of triggered?
Yeah, a little bit.
Jacob, clip this.
A little bit. If they have real patients, they don't have the time to be posting 8,000 times a day and being all over the place. They're in a fucking office working on people.
I don't think people realize, I say this all the time, I don't think people realize, so if you, I checked one day last week, and this is standard, I'm anywhere from like 40 to 70 emails a day. I had 67 emails one day last week. I don't think people, these are check-in emails, assuming even if the total time from opening an email, reading it, thinking about the response, making diet changes, even if that's only 10 minutes, that's 670 minutes. What is that? 10, 11 hours, a little over 11 hours. That's not counting peeing. That's not counting eating. You know, so if these type of things where you're working in a customized process with people is incredibly time consuming.
Yes. People do not understand how much time this actually takes. Like the actual dollar per hour to actually go, I shouldn't be talking about this on the, the business side of things, but the actual dollar per hour that goes into when you're really working with someone to get them better, to get them from point A to point B, and not just get them there, but teach them, it is so time consuming. So I think where you were going, I think we were talking about this at one point, where you hear these coaches who say they've helped thousands of people over the year, and you're like, do you have a way to stop?
Yeah, well, do the math on that. If you worked with,
I have.
Yeah. So if you have 200 clients, you're going to get, that's 200 emails per week. So you're like, what is that? 25 emails a day. But you get follow-up emails and question emails. So right away, that's 50 emails a day minimum, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, including Christmas, including when you go on vacation, including while you're doing a table talk. Those are coming in every 15 minutes. You don't get a break from them. I got to drive back to Michigan for 5 hours. Those 5 hours, I'm getting an email every 15 minutes. That doesn't go away. And that's so if you run that to the number of people who work 2,000 clients, that would that's like 40 hours of work a day.
I think I have a blog post where I did it on 3,000 because I read somewhere somebody said they worked with 3,000 athletes, and it happened to be the week before we had a seminar, and Buddy Morris came out here, and he's the second. Boyd Epley was the first strength coach ever hired. Buddy, I believe, was the second. So the second strength coach ever hired. How many athletes do you think that you've worked with? And he's like, I'm like, hey, we're thinking it through, and it's not even close to 1,000, right? Because it's football team. How many's on a football team, right? So if you work at a university, you have a football team.
And that's not even individualized.
So let's say 120, and then 3/4 of them return each year.
Yeah.
So there's only another. So you do the math, it's like, it's nowhere close to 3,000. And they're like, how in the fuck does this person who's been doing it
each individually also, not even as a team coach.
Yeah, been in the industry for 5 years and has worked with thousands of clients. I'm like, okay, so you're a great salesperson and you've sold 1,000 clients, but obviously they all sucked because nobody re-upped. You know what I'm saying? Like most people that are in the personal training sphere that are training people in person and stuff like that, they're if they're good, they keep clients forever. I mean, you just said you've been working with him for 2 years, right?
And he's stuck with me as long as he's good.
Yeah, but you see what I'm saying though. There's only so many people a person can hold.
Yeah, you can almost make an argument that if you're a good coach, you don't
have open spots
because you don't have turnover.
Yeah. You don't. You
don't have 3 spots left.
You never.
For a limited time.
No, you'd have a waiting list or whatever. And the same things with what we're talking about here, and. So the referral, that would be probably something to consider if you're looking for somebody, is find other people that have had the same problem and gotten around it, and then contact them and say who helped you.
Yeah.
Right, then there's that referral, which is the best base, to build a business is through the referrals anyhow. And then you might find that person is going to have to help you get in with whoever that you want to work with.
And they may even tell you to go see someone else instead.
Yes, because it may be a waiting process. So unfortunately, the good people are really good, and they're really hard to get their time unless you have a way in. And then I'm going to run this into a little caveat, another rant. Don't ask somebody as a favor to get in with somebody else unless you, and if you're that, like, so people will ask me, hey, can you get me in with Justin? I'm like, dude, I got to figure out if you're even going to be worth and you're going to be compliant. And because if I refer anyone to him or to her or to you, to anybody, and then there's some slapdick that's a waste of time, then I just lost my credibility for somebody that I really want to refer, right? So you kind of want to be in that position that if I get somebody that really needs help and then I can reach out, they're going to say, okay, this is cool. It's going to be a good client. He wouldn't waste my time if it wasn't going to be a good client. So that's the other end of it. If you're a person that's going to give somebody referrals that is busy, granted, you're not making any money on it, but do the footwork and make sure that this person's going to at least have a 60%. Granted, most people aren't going to be compliant, right?
Can I real quick, because you said me, I don't want anyone to get anyone that's listening to this that might think about asking me for a position. I just want to make sure I don't care. Like when he says like referral a good person, it doesn't mean that they're advanced enough or a good enough competitor. I don't care about that at all. I care that you want to work with me and you're willing to work hard. And honestly, I'd almost prefer typically the worst clients are the high level people. They're easy, and it's nice you get to claim, look what I did. This guy won these shows when he was already winning shows. The best clients are the ones who you get to that level. That's the most rewarding. And so I don't care if you even lift. Because I started out as a nutritionist for cardiology group. I still have some cardiology patients. I have a lot of IBS, Candida SIBO type patients, Crohn's patient clients. And so that's all I care about is that you, one, are willing to work hard, and two, you want to work with me because then it means you're going to value my advice. And that's what Dave meant, not that you're not you're skilled enough.
Well, there's another thing too that I don't want to not be mentioned here is don't not reach out to somebody like Dani or Justin just because you think they're busy. Always, you're stupid to not reach out.
Those are always the best clients.
Yeah.
The ones that don't appreciate your time, they're the ones who don't care. Even if you say it's always the ones who would be the best clients. You're like, well, I don't know if they have room, so I'm not going. Those are always if you're that person, reach out because you're always the best client.
Well, the other side of the online stuff, then I'll let you go, is the side that people don't see is you never lose like one client in a week. You lose like 8. It isn't just like this gradual. It's just like boom, right? So if that's why I'm saying don't not ask, because you could happen to land that DM or that email during one of those times where you just you had one of those days like the fuck just happened.
I just had 5 payments not go through.
Exactly. So there's your way in, right? Because they're like, then anyhow. So I don't want people to feel, you get what I'm saying? Like, I can't waste. And then they feel like they need to. I don't want to. There are different tier coaches. They shouldn't go to like a lower tier because they don't think this person is going to be available. That's.
Yeah,
completely.
Those are usually the best clients, the ones that are considerate like that. Because they will appreciate your time.
And from the client side too, I think that it's important to know that like any coach that you want to work with is going to be more than a coach. They're going to have a deeply, deeply rooted why behind what they do. Period. Full stop. I think everyone at this table can articulate their why. And if there's an alignment between where you want to go and where you are right now, and you need someone to fill that gap, if you speak with a coach who has enough conviction to live in that why, I don't care how full my roster is. I'm probably going to be making room for you. And I think Justin would say the same too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like I said, there'll be times where you're booked and you think, okay, this I can't keep.
I can't possibly do one more.
But someone will reach out and they'll have, and it's almost never the competitor. It's always someone will reach out that's got like just a story, and it's like, wow, like I know this person's, would die for this, and they're the person you want to work with. You'll make room for them.
I have some of my favorite clients are these like middle-aged dudes who are like, well, I know you only work with like really, really strong people and like competitors, and I'm like,
bullshit.
And I'm like, homie, like, can we just get on a call real quick? Can I just talk to you and tell you I think it's badass that you want to get better? And like, my favorite is when you get a client who thinks their best is behind them, and you're like, hang on, let's break that ceiling real quick. And you see this evolution happen, and all of a sudden they start to think about themselves differently. And, if you look back at it, there's a trajectory changer when they chose to reach out. And again, anytime you're looking for help from someone, you can tell, which coaches are out there to be, Sam and I talked about this a lot yesterday. You can tell when coaches are out there because they want to be important versus when coaches are there because they genuinely want to see you get to wherever it is you want to go. Someone comes to me and they say, I just want to be able to pick up my dog. I'm like, great.
That's like a generalized thing. I always notice that with people that don't with business. There's like 2 business owners. There's the people who want to build a successful business, and there's the people who want everyone to know that they own a business. And it's like really distinct personalities. And whoever you're doing business with, for me, I always want to do the business with the person who wants to build a business, not the person who wants everyone to know they own a business.
Yeah, I heard something the other day that I can't remember where I heard this, so it could be bullshit too. So that a short-term business plan in Japan, guess what that is? It's 20 years.
I was going to say, I know
where
it's
here,
crazy,
here a short-term business plan is like 3 months.
Yeah.
I mean, 20 years is a long-term business plan. To them, it's no. The short-term's 20, long-term, it's 50. So think about that, because it's when it comes to, if I'm helping somebody with training, I want them to think Personally, I want 4 years out, but I'll take 2. I want 2 years, and let's work back from the 2 years. So there's more, the decisions are better, the templating for the training's better. You know, if there's nutrition that's involved in that, now you can distinctly see here we can risk getting probably a little bit too fat. If you can risk getting a little bit too fat, it gives you more room to play and not more room to play, you can take some bigger risks because you have time to mitigate if they end up a bloated pig, you know, so it gives you more time. Where if they come in, it's 6 months, or you're like, well, fuck, you know, what can we do here? You know, there's not a whole lot.
Yeah, you can make wrong decisions because you don't
learn them.
Yeah, well, and the way to get the best long-term progress. Well, we were talking about this yesterday. Just as a general rule in life, the way to have your best future is almost always to be doing the thing you don't want to do right now. You know, right now,
Absolutely.
I'd love, you know, let's all get drunk. That's what's fun right now. But that doesn't improve. You know, that's not what improves the future. You know, you work now, and you're gonna. In the future, you're still going to be doing the thing you don't want to do. It's just going to be such an improved future for you that even thing you don't want to do then is much better than the thing you would be wanting to do if you hadn't done that your whole life.
I think anytime you're working with a coach too, and this is my very best friend in the entire world is so vision oriented, and she has challenged me so much, even the last couple months, where she's had me sit down and say, Dani, when was the last time you sat down with a client and said, where are we going in 3 years? Not where do you want to be in 3 years? But assumed that you are going to help them in that duration of time. And I think in coaching too, like,
I like that.
You know, we don't think enough about, maybe this is just me, you know, having a little bit more of a scarcity mindset that I should, but I'm so worried about keeping my clients sometimes that I don't want to have that conversation of assuming that I get to be in their corner for this long. I mean, it's a privilege. Coaching really is a privilege. And I think we as coaches probably need to do a little bit better job of stepping up and kind of assuming like, hey, where are we going in this time?
Well, think of how much better of a coach you could be. Like, and granted, I know this is like pretty much an impossible situation. If you had a 2-year buy-in, like, you know, for a fact they're staying for 2 years. Now, you know, they're going to have times where it's up, down, compliance, non-compliance, and all that, but think of how much better you could be if you had that.
I think Dani's husband's a perfect example. If all we had was his first off season with me, I mean, not like it was a bad off season, but after, you know, learning about him and learning his body compared to the year he's had this year.
Oh my God.
You know, if we didn't have that, and if he started over with someone else, and even it could have been even a better coach, and it would have been maybe even better first year progress, but it still wouldn't have been what it is for him this year because we knew from day one post show exactly how to treat everything. I
can't wait to see him on stage this year because of the amount of change that he's had in this. I mean, you saw him here in August. I mean, he's enormous right now, absolute tank. And it's been really, really cool too, because I think the longer you work with a coach, so we talked about the decision fatigue and just doing kind of what you're told and being like the dumb bodybuilder that just, you know, executes. And really, the longer you work with a coach, whether it's nutrition, training, rehab, whatever, the amount of learning that we do about how you respond to things. I mean, I've got some clients that have been with me for like 2.5, 3 years now. And I already know, I can tell just looking at their movement, I'm like, they've got something going on, whether it's psychologically or, you know, physically, whatever. The amount of help we can give you it's astronomically more.
I have a really good example, actually, if anyone wants to find him on Instagram, Paul Barnett. I'm not sure his Instagram handle, but Paul Barnett, I'm sure he'll bring it up. He came to me, we worked together, and we prepped him for a show. And I don't think I nailed it for the show. He did well, and he was shredded, but I think I over-dieted him, and I think we pushed a little too hard at the end because I was worried he wasn't going to be ready in time, and I thought he was smaller than he could have been. And so would have been perfectly acceptable if he switched coaches. You know, I mean, he did well, but I don't think we nailed it 100%. But what we learned from that allowed us for him to have what I think is possibly the best offseason in the history of the sport. He's added 90 pounds.
Oh my God, that's a human.
And in good condition. And because, the reason we did it is because we learned some things about what how his metabolism just took off to the end of the diet. And we learned some things about how he processes carbs, how he handles the high carb days that we were able to use in the off season to our advantage that we didn't know until we used them to the disadvantage in prep.
Yeah.
But so I hope people are looking. I think Dave's going to find him. I don't think I've ever seen an off season like he had, and we wouldn't have had that if one, if we didn't have what I hate calling them mistakes because he was in shape for a show, but it wasn't
as good as it could have been.
And if we didn't have those mistakes, and if he didn't stick with me through those mistakes,
Right.
he wouldn't have had what, like I said, I think might be the best offseason in the history of the sport.
I love that you actually just admitted that like it could have been better, because I think so many coaches want to go out there and be like, oh, look at this person that I absolutely shredded and so jacked and we nailed their peak, and you're like, okay, how do you know?
Yeah.
How do you know it couldn't have been a little bit better? Like, are you that egotistical?
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but that's really what it comes down to.
Well, it's also that relationship, right? Like that's one of the coolest things about being able to work with you guys over the last few days is your commitment to the relationship that you have with your clients and with your athletes and with your patients or whatever, right? Like, you're committed to their success above all else, right? Like, you're committed to them succeeding in finding new goals that are even better than what they want to hit now, right?
Right.
And it's one of those things where like you do not develop that skill. And as a coach, that's a skill. Like to build those relationships, that's a skill. And that's something that I think that we've talked about is like that ability to build those relationships it just needs to be better with most people.
Especially, I
talk
think,
about.
I know you work with quite a few people who have pain, right? And I think that anytime there's pain involved, there's a special level of vulnerability. And I think that's where I get a lot of buy-in with my clients too, is like they really genuinely want to be helped. I mean, you think about the times you've been down in life and someone really wants to help you, right? And it's, I think our physical body is very much the same, to where when someone, that is absurd. He literally added another human being on there, just in width.
He's a fucking cartoon character. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
But yeah, in dealing with people who are in pain, you have to be able to speak to them where they're at, and you have to build that relationship, because otherwise there's nothing worse than being in a dark place alone. Right?
And that's usually when you're the most alone.
Absolutely.
Because people don't reach out for help. And
Right.
then people, you don't look like you want help because
And that cycle just keeps going. I think there really is an art as a coach of making yourself available and being vulnerable and letting people know your story. And I mean, when you're hurting, not when you're hurting, but when you're working with people who hurt,
Where did they hurt you?
where? But you know that when you're working with people who hurt, there's a lot more that comes into it. And they almost don't want to tell you if something is continuing to bother them, because they want to just hope that things are going to get better, right? Like, oh, I was doing this movement and it really hurt, but I just figured it was okay. And it's like, okay, you're not in this alone. You don't have to be.
Yeah,
and
they also
that's a hard thing to get them to
Right.
believe.
And there's also times, and I'm sure you've seen this, where they think their pain is a burden to you. As
Oh
their
man,
coach.
yeah. And
Right.
it's. I'm like, homie, this is why I'm here. Like, you are literally paying me to help you not hurt.
I'm so
You realize
intrigued
this,
with what
right?
you're saying right now, because I would think it would be the opposite, that people would be bitching and complaining about little things.
It's both.
Okay.
It's both.
There is both.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think, pain is such an interesting thing. We could have a whole talk on pain science. I won't go down that route, but
Next time you're here.
pain is one of those really interesting things where people deal with it one of two ways. They either completely ignore it and think everything is fine, and they're super bullheaded. I don't know if you know anything about that, Dave.
Well, I mean, in Roadhouse, didn't he say pain don't hurt?
Yeah.
Or they sense like the tiniest little thing, and they think that you need to like duct tape them together. And so much of, I think, what you and I do is kind of understand, okay, what's their reality, right? And what's their perception, because their perception will always drive their reality of where they are. And coaching through pain is a very different art than coaching like the programming side of things, right? And I think that's where a lot of this multifactorial, multidisciplinary stuff that you were talking about with finding a clinician, where if they're a one-stop shop, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's where the higher level competitors become the problem to work with.
Right.
Because to them, that's the necessary, and so they won't, that's what I think you're seeing, they're not going to tell you. It's like, it's just my elbow, it's no big deal, go away in 2 weeks. Or maybe it is, so.
And I think you both work with very similar situations where your short-term goal is to make somebody potentially uncomfortable, right? Like not necessarily in an injury state, but the rehab process for a physical injury isn't comfortable.
Well,
So
again, I feel like I have people always ask me like, who's your niche? What's your avatar? And I'm like, literally everyone, because I don't know that there are many clinicians that compete in multi-sports, looked at the science of programming for multiple sports and the pain science behind things, and like can blend all of that. But it really depends. some people, have to be okay with a little bit of uncomfortable. They need to know that they're not going to, burst into flames. And other people need to be told this shouldn't hurt. Like, that actually is a problem. Like, I'm sure you've had some injuries in the past. You're like, it's fine. I'm just gonna rub some dirt on it and keep going. And then 3 weeks later, you're like, now I'm T-Rexing, trying to like use my shoulder.
Yeah, but just like what we were talking about, even
for me, it's discomfort. I mean, because what you're here to change. You're here to not stay the same. And
right.
Staying the same is comfortable. I mean, that's that's what the body wants to do. So it's a hard. I mean, for competitors, it's not. But that's the hard. Like the lay person I work with, that they don't, because they're fed kind of a lie by the diet people on TV and the internet. Where it's like, the painless easy diet. Where like they think you can't beat science. The only way to lose stored energy from the body, you want to lose fat, but the only way to do that is to eat less calories than you burn. It doesn't matter how many calories you burn. Even if you only burn 500 calories a day, if you have the worst metabolism in the world, the only way to lose calories from your body is to eat less than that. And that's uncomfortable. And it's uncomfortable from an evolutionary standpoint, because you have to think, we didn't always have refrigerators and food everywhere, so we needed a really strong system to keep us alive. And what that is when you have like stretch receptors on your stomach. Your stomach gets empty. That's the first signal. It sends out a mild pain, basically, that you're hungry. And then you get deeper. And most people have never felt hunger past that level in first world country. People in contest prep have felt the next level of hunger, which is depletion hunger. And if you ever watch like Survivor Man or something, they'll talk about that kind of hunger. And it's always interesting how they describe it, because if you've competed, that hunger. They're talking about like, I just need protein, energy, or where you just like normal people, energy comes from an energy drink. That's a different kind of energy. The real energy, like survival energy, is when you don't have nutrients in your body and you're living off stored nutrients in your body and you're so depleted, then energy actually does come from food. And you get so low energy without it. And so and it goes in both ways. If you're dieting, you're eating less calories than you burn. Your body isn't a scientist. Your body only knows that we're not finding enough food to kill, or we're not a good hunter, And then eventually you get deeper into that, and you get the next level of discomfort, which is low energy and lethargy. And why is that? Well, if there are no animals to kill, what's the best way to survive? To move as little as possible, to sit in your cave and burn no. So you sit there incredibly food focused. In case any food does come across you, you're not going to miss it. Or a rat in the corner, or a little leaf or something.
Dog kibble that falls on the ground.
Yeah, anything, and then to have very, very low energy, so you don't move. And so you have to fight through all of that.
When you're scraping the last grain of rice off the plate.
Yep, and licking the bottom. Yeah.
Licking your sugar-free ketchup off the plate.
Yeah.
Definitely haven't been there.
Yeah, drinking pickle juice and anything.
Yeah.
But and then it goes the other way. To add size, adding good size, because adding weight is easy, because that's comfort weight, because that's survival weight, that's fat. Adding fat is easy, because from that same standpoint, in the cases where food is plentiful, your body, what's comfortable is overeating the stuff that'll add fat, because that helps you survive the next famine. So to get muscularly big, you got to do the opposite. You don't get to eat the good food. You have to fight the signals that your body says, I don't want to eat more chicken and rice because I don't need that. It's not adding fat to my body right now. It's adding muscle, which doesn't help my survival. So yeah, my whole existence is discomfort.
Well, it's everything. It's training, it's nutrition, it's business, it's everything. I've always said through adversity comes prosperity, right? And through obsession comes progression. So there's those two things, the obsession and the adversity are things you have to lean into no matter what you're doing. If you're constantly leaning away from those things, don't bitch about what you don't get. Because you're not willing to pay the price to get it.
Yeah, the easy path has a lot of people along it. If you want to stand out, you can't.
Well, that's what's sold, especially in the industry we're in.
Yeah,
that's all it's about. Pain-free powerlifting. What the fuck is that? Just think about that. You're going to put a maximal weight on your back. There's nothing pain-free about that.
1,000 pounds on your back hurts.
There's no way to, well, even if you're
the only way to avoid that is to not have a lot of weight on your back.
Even if you're a 300-pound max squatter, 275 on your back is not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be pain-free. What the fuck is pain-free? But I'll stop.
So we're running up just about 2 hours. Do we want to bring this in for a minute?
Any questions that?
Yeah, actually, we did just get a super chat that came in. Michael Means, 5 months out from my meet and accumulating volume and working on my weaknesses. Assuming I start my 3-week My peak 3 weeks out. What is the ideal length for transmutation block where I raise intensity and drop volume? So essentially switching from volume to that peak. Like what length of time would you say would be a good general rule for this guy? Because obviously we don't know exactly who he is, what he is.
Give me the question again.
Transitioning from volume to his peak.
Yes.
Right? How long of that should that phase be?
Before the peak?
Before the peak.
And
It's a 3 week peak.
He's only got a 3 week peak. So this is all blocked.
Yeah, 5 months.
Fucking 8 weeks.
Yeah,
I mean,
there
it's
you
a
go.
general question. I'm going to give a general answer. Fucking 8 weeks.
Beautiful.
2 blocks.
Anything there? Anything you want to add?
It's a hard question to answer
Yeah,
because
right.
I don't know what the blocks are that are going to be stacked into this, and I don't know how long the blocks are. I don't know what kind of health and condition he's in right now. Is he even at the starting gate? Like I talk about, you can't train for meat until you're relatively healthy enough to start training for the meet. So 8 weeks, there you go. You know, that's 9 times a 3 week peak there. Fine. That's assuming he's at the starting gate and there's going to be 2 stacked strength blocks.
Beautiful. That was easy. A couple other questions that we got. Just very, again, a lot of these questions are just wildly specific. So I'm going to try to take a more general kind of focus in on them. If someone is struggling with their bench press as their squat's real good, their deadlift is monumentally bigger, and they just keep running into roadblocks with their bench, right? What should they do focusing in on their training, right?
I'll let Dani
What do you
answer.
think, Dani?
What weight class are they?
Let's go 198.
Because I think, and I don't want to speak on powerlifting because I'm not a powerlifting expert, but just from dieting people, I noticed that it seems that pressing is so joint compression related, meaning that someone gets leaner and a lot of times their deadlift goes up and their squat usually holds strength, but they always lose pressing strength. So I was going to say if it's a heavier weight class, get more bloated on bench day. But
Yeah, it's funny actually that you say that because that's something that I've definitely noticed in the off season too. Is like pressing is just so body weight dependent.
and even bloat dependent, because you think about it, you got all these small joints. Now, the squat, like wearing knee sleeves helps, but
your knee sleeves are your bloat, basically.
Yeah. So, but it helps, but not a dramatic. But like elbow sleeves and stuff, or a bench shirt really helps on bench. So if you can get more bloat around your shoulder and elbow joints, you create that natural compression. It makes a bigger difference because the X amount of bloat on a small joint is going to be a higher percentage increase because the weights on bench are just lower. Mm-hmm. But don't let me answer because I'm not the powerlifting expert. Don't listen.
Any tips for someone that is going to be going, and this is for Dani, to go from powerlifting into bodybuilding for the first time?
Oh, so many.
Yeah.
Male or female?
I imagine this is a male.
Oh man, there are a lot. I think you're going to need to learn to train. I think training is a skill, right? Like there's a difference between training for strength and training for hypertrophy. And we talked on that a little bit earlier, but training for strength is very much efficiency. It's very neurally driven. Training for hypertrophy, again, is so much a skill. Number one, you need to actually learn how to perform a movement in and of itself, like standardize every rep. And then from there, you need to be able to take that rep and actually maintain that technique to whatever proximity to failure you're looking for. I think training for bodybuilding is an entirely different skill set altogether, and learning how to actually contract the muscles like we talked about. You can't strengthen what you can't find.
Yep.
I like that she asked male or female, and we just talked about this actually. I think women have a easier transition, and I think women respond better in bodybuilding by training for powerlifting than men do because of the way their bodies are built. Women on average have about 2/3 of the muscle mass naturally in their legs as men do, but they only have about 1/3 of the mass in their upper body. And then they also have wider hip structure, and the way their knees, the angle from the hip to their knee is different also. And so if you look at powerlifters, they'll be very muscular. You look like a Larry Wheels. He looks like a bodybuilder, except for his legs. And that's very common. But with women, it's different because they have that higher muscle mass, compared to their upper body than men do. They respond better to squats. One, because they have more contractile tissue to respond to, even if it's, even if they're squatting like a powerlifter to spread it out. But two, because of their hip structure. If you look at, and I don't want to say this as an expert because I'm not, and I could be wrong on this, but if you look at the way female powerlifters squat, their stance, bar position, where it's on their back, it tends to be much more quad dominant of a squat position than the men do. I don't really see the really, really wide stance squat.
I I disagree with that a little bit, because I think that a lot of females in particular, if you take the low bar squat, right, like where you're going to be able to handle a little bit more weight, you're going to get more neural overflow from multiple muscle groups. And at the end of the day, as long as you're not taking a 1 rep, like let's say you're doing sets of 6, something that's like reasonable, right? Like I think any more than 6, it's really hard to maintain every rep standardized, to be honest. More than 6 is kind of dumb at times. But if you're actually contracting that tissue and you're able to load a little bit more weight and get more co-activation across the joints, again, the co-activation will almost always permit greater force production. And that force production, especially if you can move both explosively when it's appropriate and or when you can work on something like a hack squat, the actual tension and placing that where you need to. I mean, it's all about intent, right? But I do think that I think the bigger reason that women respond to powerlifting training is that it's co-activation, because we're not really taught growing up how to move heavy weight. And there's something about putting a barbell in our hands that actually encourages us to kind of raise that strength ceiling. And anytime you're raising the strength ceiling in one movement, you're probably going to get at least a little bit of carryover to other movements. So depending on if it's male or female, big difference. Me and Dave train totally differently. He trains totally like a bodybuilder, and he's done great with it. He's had an awesome off season. I went power building, for lack of a better word. And I feel like off season so far has been productive, but I do think that training style makes a huge difference. But overall, I think that they'll need to learn to figure out how to manipulate their variables between frequency, intensity, volume. You have to know where you're at with that, and you need to be comfortable doing the minimum, because all you're trying to do is move the bar just a little bit every session. And the biggest mistake I see people make when they get into a hypertrophy block is they think that it's a bunch of volume, right? They think 4x10 on everything. And how much of that is actually meaningful, rather than just accumulating a whole bunch of systemic fatigue that you're going to have to recover from anyway, and you might not even be getting as much neural output and force production as really needed to generate hypertrophy.
3 things I'll put out there, assuming that you said it's a male, is first is commit to at least 6 months, right? Don't jump around. Don't get in there and after a month think, oh shit, my bench max is going to be under, and you're going to jump off and start training more strength oriented. Realize your bench is probably going to go down, but the rep strength is going to go up. Second thing, understand that nutrition is extremely important every day, not 5 days and then 2 days for shit. Or this is a bigger thing than people realize, right? So they'll be kind of on point for 5 days and they just eat 1 meal. On the 6th day, they're busy, they're working. I'm sure you guys hear it all the time.
You think that's, because most of the days you're doing the right thing, but that's 20% of the week.
So that washes
80% of the athlete you could be. You're a pretty terrible athlete.
And you washed out the surplus that you just created. So that's the third thing. This is the biggest thing. You're not as big as you think you are.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny too. You get these guys that think that they're underdeveloped and like, oh, I need an arm day. And it's like, oh, dude, you just got to get bigger.
Well, I'm more along the lines of, you might know, how much did Ronnie Coleman weigh when he won the Olympia?
His first Olympia was 246 pounds.
Okay.
Yet every local guy thinks they're going to be a super heavyweight in their first show. Newsflash, you are not going to be 240 pounds in shape. You're not.
Yes.
No one is. Ronnie Coleman was. I mean, now guys are getting bigger, but you're not, and I went through that too, because I was 280 pounds. I had some ab outlines. Of course, I'm going to be 250 shredded, right? 213 when I stepped on stage.
Yeah.
I was just about to ask, what's like the average amount of weight that you think your male heavies or supers lose in the off season not in the off season, in prep to be stage ready?
The big guys, it's more than you'd think because there's so much fullness in water.
Right.
But it's 30 pounds minimum, 40, 50 pounds, and that's not 50 pounds of fat. There's probably at least 20 pounds of water in glycogen.
Well, take the power lifter that's converting though, right?
Yeah.
So you got the power lifter that's converting. I'll just hypothetically say it weighs 280 pounds. In their mind, they think they're going to be shredded at 240.
Yeah.
Right? No, you might weigh under 200 pounds. You might end up being 205 pounds. So going into it, this is the advice I have for him, wrap your head around that. You may end up being 205 pounds.
Mm-hmm. And then, which makes people panic, but go look at Flex Wheeler 1993 Arnold. He was like 5'11", 5'10", 5'11". He weighed 213 or 218. Go look at those pictures of the 1993 Arnold Classic and tell me Flex Wheeler looks small. But we worry too much about the weight. If Flex Wheeler's walking around, he looks freaking huge. no one saw him and said, hey, what do you weigh? And he says 213. And they're like, oh, you're small, never mind. You know, you got 22-inch arms. So like the scale's the worst thing for physique, period, because the scale's all water. It's all water. And anyone who's cut weight for meat knows how much the scale's water. You can lose 30 pounds and then have the weight back the next day. How much did you? Yeah. Well, you didn't lose 30 pounds of fat, gain 30 pounds of muscle in that 36 hours. You changed nothing. And so, like we talk about adding 20 pounds of muscle a year doesn't happen. But assuming it does, that's less than a half a pound a week. Well, half a pound of water, you can change a half a pound of water. This is a half a pound of fluid, Whether or not I drank this, this is the difference of muscle mass for the whole week. So now if I don't drink this today, I didn't gain that half a pound on the scale. Now I think I gained no muscle mass. I did. It's just that water, So the scale is always water. So worrying about the scale for bodybuilding ruins everything.
It's interesting coming from a powerlifting background and going into bodybuilding, because if you've competed for an appreciable amount of time, you're trying to stay within a weight class, or you're trying to make weight or whatever. Maybe you're smart and you don't, and you just go where your body wants to go. But it was really interesting transition into bodybuilding, because I never really understood when people could say that the scale didn't matter to them, because I identified for so long with trying to make weight someplace, and now it really is. It's a really interesting kind of phenomenon. You hear about it all the time, but when you experience it, it's kind of like anything else in prep, You hear about what it feels like to get that lean, but when you actually do it, and you're like, oh, I'm still made of water. This is weird. Yeah, people always think that like when you get shredded, you're going to feel super hard. Yeah. But you can probably speak to this too. You're like, I'm still kind of soft
squishy,
and jello-y.
Yeah,
squishy.
Like it's the same squish.
Just a little jellyfish.
Yeah.
So we got one more question here, and I want both of your opinions on this. Justin, I noticed you performed a lot of weighted stretching in your documentary. Any updated thoughts on the subject?
I was not consistent with weighted stretch. I don't have a deep scientific statement on that. I don't know. I don't know whether there's value in fascia stretching. I think there's probably some, because there's stretch receptors. There are like stronger muscle fibers will contract more strongly after what do they call it, like a myostatic stretch reflex or whatever. So there are cases like there's correlations between a stretched tissue and the contractility of that tissue, and I think there's more involved with muscle mass than just the contractile tissue, the muscle fibers, and we call it myofibril muscle growth. There's sarcoplasmic muscle growth, and I would argue that the potential for that is much higher than the potential for myofibril growth. And the clearest example is who we have right here. Powerlifters are going to have like much higher percentage of myofibril growth because they don't do any of the blood volume sarcoplasmic growth. But a bodybuilder is going to look much more round and muscular, and that's from that sarcoplasmic growth. And I think there's probably is some potential improvement to that sarcoplasmic growth from stretching that tissue out while it's filled with blood and nutrients training. I don't know whether the weighted stretch helps, and I don't know that I noticed a dramatic improvement in things while I was doing that, and I didn't. It wasn't something that became a long-term permanent part of my routine, although it is a part of my routine on body parts I was trying to bring up to stretch them frequently during training. And we talk about lats. We did DC rows yesterday, and I credit that with completely changing my back from my lats being like a weak body part to one of my best body parts. And during that time, I was also pretty obsessive about stretching my lats during back workouts. Between every set, it was just like, it just kind of became like almost like a tick, almost like a habit. I would, really stretch while there was blood in that muscle. I don't know if that played a role in anything, but my back did improve quite a bit while I was doing that. But again, that is something I do. Like when I'm really focused on a muscle group, I tend to stretch it during the workout. So I can't really say more than that.
A couple of thoughts there. I think that the sarcoplasmic growth is a little bit easier than the myofibrillar because it's not metabolically demanding tissue, right? Like that's not active tissue so much as it is like a storage area, right? So by adding that, you're not increasing your body's need or really like the daily energy needs. I think the interesting thing about stretching mid-workout too is especially you think about muscle groups and how well people can actually sense or feel them. And when you can feel a stretch on a muscle, you're probably going to have improved proprioception. And when you have that proprioception, you're probably going to have a better time actually contracting using that muscle.
That's a good point. I could easily agree with if the idea was presented that the reason my lats grew was because I got so much better at feeling them from stretching them. That would make perfect, I mean, I'm sure that played a role in it.
I think the other thing with the loaded stretching too is setup, right? Just like any other movement, setup is going to be a big part of execution and the overall intent and outcome. So something like if you think about a loaded lat stretch like you're hanging, right, versus like the DC or the Dante quad stretch, right, where the quad stretch actually has a little bit more occlusion, which is way different than just the loaded stretch. And so you're kind of looking at the chemical changes in the area of what's actually occurring. So is the loaded stretch truly the mechanical force, or is it more the chemical component of the occlusion that happens with the quad stretch?
Very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even just seeing it yesterday, I mean, and obviously Dani can speak more to this, the fact that you're bringing awareness to that area, but if you're also increasing your range of motion, like between sets, like you're then able to put more of that muscular tension or the mechanical tension into that muscle too, right?
Well, that's what, I mean, you think about every powerlifter wants to say they're immobile, and you think about the role of mobility in bodybuilding, not just posing, but in bodybuilding training, right? So if you think about just the actual structure of a muscle and its resting length tension and its ability to actually lengthen or contract, you're going to generate more force when you provide greater overlap between those cross bridges to contract. And if mechanical tension is the main driver of that mTOR pathway, of course, you're going to set yourself up for success by being able to maintain greater range of motion. And I think that's one of the things that people always think they're using full range of motion, but how often have you trained someone? I mean, even here, when we were here in August and I was doing that chest press, and you're like, Dani, come on. And let me increase my range a little bit. And I was like, all right, well, that was humbling.
Well, when I heard you ask the question, I'm going a different route. I'm going the guy that's got fucked up joints, right? So there's three things that I do to maintain my joint integrity. Now, it's not good. I don't want it to get worse, right? It's probably not going to get better. I just don't want it. I want to maintain it. That's how I've put off the shoulder replacement since 2004. Three things that I swear by personally for me. One of them is the loaded stretching, right? Now, I need to be clear on what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about the loaded stretching on like a dumbbell fly, like dog crap. I'm going to do the loaded stretching on a cable where I'm taking gravity out of it, so I'm putting my joint in the best, safest position I can be in. And then go to where the muscle, and this is the last set, last rep type thing, and probably even lighter weight. Go to where the muscle tightens, hold it for just a couple seconds, and then PNF it, basically what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to flex against it, let it come back, and then I know just from doing this for so long where my end range is. When I'm in that end range, maybe I do a 20 count or something like that, but I don't even think that's the relevant part. The relevant part is this is where it's going to start, right? Then I could PNF it to get it there. That maintains that joint range of motion. Now, the exercises are always going to be the safest possible. That's going to remove gravity and all this other kind of stuff. That's where I see the value in that loaded stretching is, do I need a lot of weight? No, because essentially all I'm doing is loaded PNF stretching because I don't have somebody here to take me through that. And then even you have somebody there to take you through that, it's really hard to manipulate where you want my thumb, my arm to be with that. The second thing is ultra high reps, 75, 100 reps, something where I'm not really contracting. It's just reverse band presses, 5-pound tricep extensions, and I don't count. I just do it for a song, just the movement to get that range. The third is concentric only work. Sled dragging, backward sled dragging, forward shoulder raises, the ski erg, for the shoulders. Just I want the eccentric taken out just so I can just pump the concentric in there. Those three things, I feel, for me, have maintained having worse joint integrity, right?
Well, it comes down to, I think what you're hitting at is like, where's the motion coming from, right? And what support are you providing to the structure? Because a PNF is basically what I took you through yesterday. I just didn't call it that. And people assume that range of motion, all range of motion is created equal, but it's not. Is it coming from, if you think about all the structures involved in a joint, right? Like you've got active and passive structures on a joint. Active structures, things like muscle, it contracts. Passive structures, joint itself, capsule, ligaments, things that don't contract. And oftentimes, and probably you can speak to this too, a lot of injury is going to happen, not acutely, but more kind of the chronic aches and pains that we get happen when we start demanding those passive structures to do what they're not designed to do.
Yes, because it's being arthritic, it builds, so you're trying to not let that build and build and build over time, because what happens is, say my main strength, range of motion, slowly gets chipped away, right? For a long time, I couldn't even get the bar to touch when I benched for many, many years. It was Ted Tolson just forcing me to start doing it with a broomstick and pushing down on it to be able to get it to where I can now certain loads I got to pull, I can't do it. But that's kind of what happens is I don't want to say aging, but say as a washed up meathead, you're already starting to lose a little bit of that range of motion. So a lot of people will just, like we talked earlier, they're just going to Ronnie Coleman in. They're just going to keep doing it, and they just keep chipping away. So you end up seeing these 60, 70-year-old dudes in the gym doing these half reps. They're not doing the half reps because they want to lift bigger weight. They can't fucking go in the other ranges. I don't want to be that dude.
Right.
Like, I'll be the half squatter always. I have no problem squatting high. I'll do that the rest of my life. But so these are the mechanisms that I'm trying to use to not be that guy. So that loaded stretching falls in there, but it's not like DC loaded stretching, and it's not even Pavlov loaded stretching. Yeah. It's just PNF, is simply what it is.
It's providing, if I'm going to simplify that a little bit, anything we do, anything is input that our brain is going to receive. Yeah. And so you're either going to have input that tells the brain, cool, we're good here, or you're going to have input that tells the brain not so much. And when we think about all of this, it really comes down to, okay, is the blockage or the reduced range of motion, is that mechanical because the joint truly has decreased joint space? Has there been a histological change in the area, whether it's tissue or the joint itself, or is this more neurogenically oriented? Now, we can use some of the neurogenic, or I should clarify that. What I mean by that is what the brain decides is okay for us to use, right? And that's really what PNF is affecting, is those kind of neural permissive pathways. Are we using those in a way that can, at the same time, maybe influence the joint space? And there's a lot that I think we could say about that. I had something else I was going with, but I lost it there.
Well, I think for me, I think that, certain things like this can become important, especially I come from this big conjugate background, right? So a lot of the things we're doing, board presses, floor presses, pin presses, high box squats, pulls off pins, pulls off blocks, they're all restricted range of motion, overload type movements where there has to be a balance, so we always try to strive for, if we're going to do this, how many repetitions are we going to end range? And then what are we trying to do to actually strengthen that end range, where that's boring, right? So it's easily skipped, but it's important because your acute injuries, I don't think are going to be avoided because of this, right? Because most acute injuries are not happening at the stretch point. They're happening when the max contraction and the muscle contracts so hard, it rips the tendon off the bone. So that's a whole different conversation that I don't know how to answer that. Hydration's all the fuck I know there. Be careful on how strong you get, how fast. And there's other things that Dani could probably expand on. But I forgot where I know it's contagious.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting too. Just thinking about conjugate, I just had this thought where you're training specifically in a range of motion, or a decreased range, and a lot of times we'll use that for rehab and things like that. But one of the biggest things that I see with these lifters who are super strong, right, is we talked about this a little bit yesterday. Our kind of, I hate the word posture because we always think about it as like how we sit and how we stand, and it's more than that. It's really like, what's our brain's most efficient way to navigate this thing called gravity that's pulling down on us, right? It's just, all it is our most efficient way of navigating gravity. And anytime we train, we're training into that specific range, right? And so this is something I talked a lot about with Casey, who's really big in his hard arch and ended up getting all the low back pumps, which is something that I know a lot of people really struggle with. But it's because you train into a range, you tell your brain, this is the input where we're strongest, and you never access the other range. And so I don't think that necessarily it's a mobility issue so much as it is just every now and then, make sure you're accessing a different range of motion. And I think that's what's interesting in transitioning from powerlifting to bodybuilding too, and some of the conjugate things that you've done where you've really focused on so much tightness and tension management, pressure generation. And we think about the net effect of that is, if I had to give one word, it's compression. And so many of the orthopedic issues and so many of even some of the muscular patterns that contribute to the maintenance of these issues are still compression oriented. And so at some point you have to open up and you have to decompress. That doesn't have to be anything fancy though. And I think so many people look for fancy solutions, and really it is just as simple as like, can you go on a cable station and maintain a row where your scapulas actually move forward?
Yeah.
And it's not coming from, your shoulder hunching forward, but like, where's the motion coming from?
Well, it's funny because even with Adam, our training partner, is like after his meet, like we lived in this extended position. And it's like one of the first things I wanted him to do is just hold something in front of him.
Yes. And that's one of the biggest things that I use in treating people too. And I was on a podcast maybe a month ago now, and we talked about, timing and periodization of some of these rehab movements. And then the coach I was on the podcast with basically said, I don't believe in GPP. And I don't think it's a GPP phase.
Like a Santa Claus thing? Like it just doesn't exist? Like
No, just that he didn't see the point in it. Like if you want to powerlift year round. If you want to be the best powerlift year round. You look at someone like John Hack, who squats, benches, and deadlifts, and that's basically what he does. I'm like, yes, from the efficiency standpoint, sure. But the question is always A, the cost, and B, at what point is staying in that one pattern actually prohibiting you from sensitizing to what that is, right? Like you don't know what 80 degrees and sunny feels like until you've lived in Columbus where it's like 20 and cold right now.
Thank you for reminding me.
You're welcome. And I think that as coaches too, it's always important to have, I don't think there's one right or wrong way, but we need to at least understand why and have a rationale for why we choose these things. But that front loaded position, God, we could talk about the influence of the rib cage and the front load on the rib cage, especially posterior rib cage for someone who's been so extended with a flat T-spine for, months on end, loading bars. And if you never come out of this, you can't re-find it. Like if you never come out of a hard arch, you can't feel that anymore because you're that's just your baseline. You're totally desensitized to it.
Fuck yeah. So I think we're going to wrap this one up. Justin, Dani, any last words? Where can people find you, I should say?
ComponentNutrition.com. It's a long word. So if you just Google Justin Harris bodybuilding or large penis club.
Go image search that one.
You're going to start using that in your hashtags.
Yeah.
Right? Perfect.
Dani, what about you?
You can find me at mergeperformancept.com.
Easy enough. All right, cool. Thank you guys for checking out this episode. As always, we appreciate you stopping by. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things. And on behalf of myself, Dave, and everybody here at Elite FTS, thank you very much, and we will